Peter Baelish stood on the ramparts of the Eyrie with the biting wind cutting across his cheeks. Far below, the swirling mists clung to the mountainsides like restless ghosts. In the distance, he could discern the faint hints of a horizon washed in pale dawn light. He had never been a man to linger in sentiment, but as he gazed out at the limitless sky above and the spiked peaks that surrounded him, he allowed himself a moment to reflect on how far he had come. He had been born in a modest tower on the Fingers, from a family of little consequence. He had carried the derisive nickname of Littlefinger since boyhood. Though some still used it with amusement, he had cleverly embraced it, learned to wear it like a piece of armor. Let them laugh, he used to tell himself. When the game was finished, he would be the one left standing. Over the years, he had amassed both coin and influence with a cunning so precise that no one ever suspected how large his web of schemes truly was. It was this cunning that had elevated him from the master of coin in King's Landing to the effective lord of the Vale. And now, if his plan worked, if everything continued to align in the manner he had orchestrated, he would claim a title no one would have ever predicted for the boy from the Fingers, King of the Seven Kingdoms. He could almost taste it, that intangible essence of power that had guided his every step since his youth. The Iron Throne had devoured many before him. It had ruined once great families, turned them into ashes and memories. Peter Baelish was confident he would not be among the devoured. Kings rose and fell, but kings often lacked the patience to harness the silent forces that truly governed the realm. Information, secrets, leverage, and betrayal. Peter had dedicated his entire existence to perfecting these arts. A mockingbird might not appear as fearsome as a dragon or as noble as a direwolf, but a mockingbird could still sing the sweetest tune, coaxing others to let down their guard. Then, when the moment was right, it could slice open its unsuspecting victims with an unassuming but lethal beak. There, in the hush of morning, he allowed himself a small smile. It was not the grin of a man gloating with vanity. Rather, it was the tight-lipped satisfaction of a man who had spent years weaving an intricate tapestry. That tapestry, which had once resembled a mere collection of disjointed threads, was beginning to take a shape that even the most imaginative lord or lady in Westeros could scarcely foresee. He turned away from the mist-shrouded mountains and made his way into the inner corridors of the Eyrie. The castle was quiet at this hour, the servants scuttling about like mice eager to evade the great hawk that was Peter Baelish. In hushed corners, men and women whispered about him, never quite certain whether he could hear every faint word. The rumor in the Vale was that Lord Baelish had ears in every hall, that he could hear a conversation if it were uttered even in the remotest crook of a corridor. Though untrue in the literal sense, it was not so far from reality when considering the web of informants he had cultivated. Fear was a useful tool, but it was knowledge and the perception of omniscience that he had truly mastered. No, he thought, halting briefly to adjust a glove on his hand. Fear alone was too blunt an instrument. Men like Tywin Lannister had used fear as a cudgel. Men like Joffrey Baratheon had used cruelty as a toy, and it had cost them dearly. Peter Baelish, on the other hand, preferred something else, something intangible that could not be easily undermined. The illusion of friendship, the appearance of loyalty. And where friendship failed, there was the promise of gold, of a more favorable match, or the sweet poison of a cunningly placed lie. He reached the solar where Sansa Stark, now posing as Elaine Stone, though fewer and fewer found that pretense convincing, was seated, reading a small book of songs. How young she still seemed, he mused. Yet how quickly her experiences had transformed her from a naive girl enthralled by tales of knights and courtly love. She had grown more poised, more guarded. Every day, the old illusions were chipped away from her bright eyes, replaced by sharper awareness. She was learning well, though sometimes he wondered if she realized the lessons that were being taught. Sansa looked up from her book at his approach. She regarded him with cautious curiosity. He knew she was polite enough to never pry outright about his comings and goings, but her curiosity lingered behind her stare. More and more, she tried to see through him. He admired the attempt, but he had decades of practice at evading transparent eyes. "Elaine," he said smoothly, using her disguised name, though they were all but alone. "You are up early." She closed the book and placed it on the table beside her. "I could not sleep," she replied. "The Vale nights are colder than I remember. Or perhaps I'm just not used to sleeping in a castle so high above the ground." He noticed the slight tremor in her voice, but he could not tell if it came from exhaustion or the chill. "Winter is coming, as your family words so aptly say." The phrase rolled off his tongue with a subtle satisfaction he hoped she would not hear. Her eyes flickered. She would always think of her mother, her father, and her siblings when she heard those words. Baelish had anticipated this reaction because it bound her to him even more. She had no other place to go. In him, she saw a strange echo of her mother, a fleeting hope that perhaps part of the future her mother had wanted could still unfold. He settled on the seat opposite her, the fire in the hearth warming his back. "I have a small task to see to in the mountains," he said quietly. "Nothing you need to concern yourself with. But I wanted to let you know I'll be gone from the Eyrie for perhaps a week." A flicker of concern passed over her features. "You're leaving. Elaine, the Vale must be protected," he said, choosing his words with care. "As Lord Protector, my presence is requested among certain mountain clans. They have grown restless, and I must parley with them to ensure they remain friendly to the Eyrie and its interests." It was a half-truth. Indeed, the mountain clans required attention, but it was not the only reason he left. He had other agendas, ones that would prepare the final pieces for the game that was about to reach its climax. She nodded, but her eyes did not hide her wariness. "Will you be safe? The roads are not without danger." He almost laughed at the question. "The roads are never safe, my dear, but if we only ever traveled when roads were safe, none of us would have ever left home. Do not worry, I've arranged for a more than competent escort. I have a gift for negotiation, you might remember." She pressed her lips together and inhaled. "Of course. Take care, my lord." He reached across and brushed her knuckles lightly with his gloved hand. "And you as well, Elaine. Soon enough, winter will be upon us, and we must be prepared in all ways." He let his final words hang in the air, knowing they would inflame her curiosity. Before she could respond, he rose and departed, the faint echo of his footsteps trailing through the corridor. She would remember this conversation, he was certain, and by the time he returned, the path to the crown would be clearer than ever. Far below the Eyrie, at the gates of the moon, Peter Baelish mounted his horse. The crisp morning air stung his lungs, and the breath of riders and animals alike wreathed in clouds around them. With a small retinue of Vale knights, men who were loyal to him by coin, persuasion, and the promise of advancement, he set out for the winding roads that led through the mountains of the moon. As they descended, Littlefinger maintained a calm facade, but inwardly he was immersed in thought. He had come to realize that crowning himself king was not a matter of mere flamboyant ambition. The actual coronation was perhaps the most trivial part. No, the real challenge lay in the labyrinthine complexities of how to engineer a realm so fractured by war, so battered by distrust, that one more disruption might go unnoticed until it was too late. The War of the Five Kings had left its scars everywhere, sowing the seeds of conflict and distrust. The houses that still stood were suspicious of each other, each uncertain who was truly an ally. Old grievances simmered, new ones were born. In that tumult, Peter Baelish had found fertile ground for his manipulations. Alliances needed money, marriages needed arrangement, secrets needed trading. He provided all of these, demanding only loyalty in return. But it was a loyalty that most gave willingly, or at least resignedly, as they found themselves indebted to him. Yes, the game was nearing its end. So many pieces were already in place. Yet one piece remained elusive, the piece that he had not yet fully entrapped. The North. He thought of Sansa Stark once more as he rode with measured pace. She was key to unlocking the North. The name Stark still held undeniable power among the Northern Bannermen, even though many had died or bent the knee to the Boltons or to others. The possibility of a surviving daughter, one married to a cunning lord who might restore Winterfell, had a powerful sway. If Baelish played it correctly, the North would rally behind Sansa Stark, and by extension rally behind Petyr Baelish. It was only a matter of turning the right gears. He had begun those maneuvers already, delivering Sansa from King's Landing, orchestrating Lysa Arryn's downfall to claim the Vale, and guiding Sansa's claim to be the rightful heir to Winterfell. Once the North was in play, he would have a substantial power base, one of the largest in the Seven Kingdoms, loyal at least in name to the daughter of Eddard Stark, or so he intended. Then the Vale, with its wealthy lords and fierce knights, would bolster that claim. And from there, it was merely a matter of undermining any other pretenders to the throne. His thoughts drifted to Daenerys Targaryen, rumored to have come to Westeros with dragons. He had not yet confirmed the rumors personally, but his little birds whispered of living dragons crossing the sea. A reckless or hasty man might have panicked at the thought of a Targaryen with an army and dragons. But Petyr Baelish saw opportunity. Throughout Westeros' long history, dragons had terrified lords into submission. But times had changed. The art of war had changed. If a Targaryen marched upon the throne, the great houses might unite against her, or they might betray each other. Dragons or no dragons, alliances decided wars. And alliances were his specialty. A cluster of mountain clansmen appeared from behind a rocky outcrop, as if conjured by Petyr's reflections. Their attire was ragged, their eyes marked by a fierce independence. The knights at Petyr's side tensed. One of the clansmen stepped forward, arms raised, and Petyr signaled his men to halt. He rode to meet the clansman. "Lord of the Vale," the man said in a gruff voice, the lines of age carved deep into his weathered face. "We heard you were coming." Petyr nodded in mild acknowledgement. "I trust the Vale's generosity remains welcome among your folk?" he asked. He knew they expected a gift, grain, steel, a few barrels of ale. Simple tokens to ensure their continued goodwill. The clansman grunted. "Aye, we welcome it, but some worry that once winter settles, the Vale lords will forget their promises. Hungry men have short patience." Petyr offered a thin smile. "Hungry men do indeed have short patience, and wise lords make sure not to leave them hungry for too long. Let's talk about how we can help each other during the snows." The clansman gestured for him to follow, and Petyr did so, leading his retinue behind him. They were taken to a cramped clearing nestled between jagged rocks, a temporary settlement where the mountain folk found shelter. Tents and roughly constructed huts stood like huddled animals against the biting wind. Smoke curled from small fires, carrying the scent of cooking meat. The clansmen eyed Petyr's knights warily, but none made a move. Petyr had orchestrated similar scenes before. The subtle negotiations with the lawless clans, the bartering of supply caravans for safe passage. He had begun this work months ago, forging fragile alliances by providing them with just enough supplies and arms to keep them content. Over time, these clans had learned that Petyr Baelish was worth cooperating with. He asked for little and gave more than any other Vale lord had. It was a small price to pay for a future where the Vale remained under his control, and that was all he needed from them. He dismounted and motioned for one of his knights to produce the sacks of grain and small chests of coin. "As promised," Petyr said. "Food to last through the next few moons, and some silver to purchase anything else you might need." The clansmen unwrapped a sack and inspected the grain, their expressions betraying both relief and greed. One of them tested a coin with his teeth. Satisfied, they pulled back and nodded. In a low voice, Petyr continued, "You know the passes through these mountains better than any men. When the snows fall, travelers will be forced to use the few roads that remain open. You can guard them, control them if you wish. But should certain travelers come through, ones I might name for you, you will see that they do not proceed without my approval." The chieftain inclined his head, eyes glinting with the unspoken question. "And what if such travelers come clad in Lannister gold or riding behind a wolf's banner?" Petyr allowed himself a small sigh, as if the question had been inevitable. "I won't name them until the time is right," he said softly. "For now, protect all who pass, but let no large force move against the Eyrie. And if you hear of news or events that might interest me, you know how to contact my men." The chieftain smirked. "We'll do as we've done, as long as you keep your promises." Peter placed a hand lightly on the chieftain's shoulder, something that might have been an insult if the chieftain considered it condescending. But he knew how to time his gestures so they were seen as friendly. "I always keep my promises," he said. When the meeting concluded, Peter rode off with his knights, leaving behind a portion of supplies and a sense of renewed alliance. He did not relish having to depend on such unpredictable folk, but a cunning man utilized every tool available. If the time came that an enemy marched on the Vale, the mountain clans would slow their approach or harass them so thoroughly that they'd think twice. In the best scenario, they would never see that day come. Over the next few days, Peter visited various lords of the Vale who remained in their holdfasts along the mountain slopes. He paid cordial visits, smiled at their wives, complimented their children, and in private he planted seeds of favor. He suggested new trade routes that could bring them wealth, proposed marriages that would strengthen their ties, and dispensed small gifts of silver or courtesy that were sure to keep them beholden. He never lied outright. Instead, he merely emphasized the bright possibilities if they continued to follow his guidance. Everything was a negotiation, every relationship a silent contract, binding them to him with chains made of courtesy and the promise of prosperity. By the time Peter returned to the Eyrie, a full week had passed, and the high castle glimmered white in the sunlight. Winter was clawing at Westeros, and the nights had grown longer. He arrived in the courtyard to find Sansa, Elaine, standing with a group of maids, apparently instructing them in some task. When she saw him, her gaze lingered. Perhaps she was surprised to see him return at all. Peter dismounted and approached her, ignoring the curious stares of the staff. She dismissed the maids and stepped forward. He offered her a courteous bow. "My lady," he said softly, "I trust all has been well." She regarded him for a moment. There was a raven from the north. It bore Lord Wyman Manderley's seal. She hesitated, as if unsure whether to impart the message. Peter's interest piqued. "And what news does Lord Manderley write from White Harbor?" "He requests alliance," she said, glancing around. "He writes that winter threatens to starve parts of the north, and he wishes to secure trade routes through the Vale to ensure his people survive. He addresses me as Lady Sansa Stark." The last words were uttered with a mixture of caution and a spark of pride. Peter smiled. It was a genuine one, bright in a way that seldom appeared on his face. "Excellent. We shall answer him graciously, of course. White Harbor is a strong port, and Manderley is known for both loyalty and ambition. If we can secure Manderley's goodwill, half the north may follow." She did not smile back. "And what do we tell him about my circumstances?" "He wants me to stand as the rightful heir to Winterfell. He speaks of forging alliances to reclaim the north for House Stark." "I am uncertain what to say." Peter placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We tell him what he longs to hear, that you are committed to the North's prosperity, and we shall do all in our power to aid them in their struggle. But we must remain cautious, my dear. The memory of your brother's war still lingers. The Lannisters watch from the south, the Boltons cling to Winterfell, and there are rumors of Targaryens stirring across the sea. We cannot reveal all our intentions at once." "Not yet." Sansa looked at him with searching eyes. "And my intentions are to reclaim the north?" She paused. "Or to help you do so?" He gave a soft laugh. "You speak as if they were separate goals. But you shall see, Sansa, that sometimes one must accept an alliance to achieve one's heart's desire. Winterfell is your birthright. I only wish to help you claim it. And in return, the Vale, the North, and your cause will prosper." He did not mention the cost of that prosperity. He did not mention his real aim, not yet. She nodded but said nothing further. In her silence, he sensed both acquiescence and unease. She was wise enough to see that if the Vale moved to restore a Stark to Winterfell, there would be conflict. War, or at least a skirmish. But there was no safe path back to the north for her. Bolton or Lannister, any number of enemies would claim her if they could. Baelish was not entirely lying when he said her best chance lay with him, and perhaps part of her believed he cared for her as more than just a pawn. That evening, once he was settled in his chambers, Peter composed a carefully worded reply to Lord Manderley, penned in Sansa's delicate script. He guided her hand in the phrasing, ensuring the message conveyed warmth and gratitude, as well as a quiet acknowledgement of the hardships besetting the North. They offered the Vale's trade routes in exchange for a promise of future loyalty and a pledge to support Sansa's eventual reclamation of her rightful home. A subtle but unmistakable reference implied that all loyal men of the North would rally when the time came. With that letter dispatched, the wheels began to turn faster. The following weeks brought more ravens from the North. Some lords, suspicious of the Boltons, expressed guarded interest. Others demanded proof that Sansa Stark truly lived. Peter obliged them with cleverly arranged letters, each dripping with carefully curated details that only a true daughter of Eddard Stark might know. Their trust grew, albeit slowly, like a hearth fire kindled in a freezing room. Simultaneously, Peter worked the Vale Lords, persuading them that help. The North would cement alliances for the difficult winter ahead. If the Vale and the North stood together, trade could flow, armies could be supported, and the Vale would be safe from southern entanglements that might arise if the Iron Throne changed hands again. Much of this was true, though not for the altruistic reasons Peter implied. One frosty night, as a gray sky wept light snow over the Ares spires, Peter found himself alone in his solar, sipping wine and pondering the final steps. Winter was nearly upon them, and soon armies would move less freely. If he were to stake a claim on the throne, he needed to ensure that the realm was divided enough, uncertain enough that no single faction could rise up and crush him immediately. King Tommen still sat on the Iron Throne, but rumor said that Cersei Lannister's power in King's Landing was waning. The High Sparrow and his zealous faith militant had weakened her hold. The Tyrells were a question mark as well. Would they remain loyal to the Lannisters if Tommen's grip loosened further? Then there was Daenerys Targaryen, somewhere in the south of Westeros with her Unsullied and Dothraki, re-establishing a foothold. And in the far north, rumors abounded of battles against the dead, though many scoffed at such tales. Peter suspected there was truth to the rumors of a supernatural threat. But for him, if it existed, it was yet another piece on the board he might manipulate. There was no shortage of wonders or terrors in Westeros. Yet in the end, men with ambition decided who wore the crown. Fear of an ancient enemy might just unify the realm under someone strong enough to guide them. Peter intended that person to be himself. His introspection was interrupted by a knock. He set down his wine and beckoned the visitor to enter. One of his personal agents slipped into the solar, a hooded man of unassuming features, the type of face one forgot the moment one looked away. "My lord," the agent said, bowing with careful deference. "I've news from King's Landing." Peter gestured for him to continue. "I'm listening. The situation in the capital grows more precarious. The faith militant has detained several members of the royal court on charges of moral corruption and heresy. Queen Cersei remains under constant threat of arrest, though she has found some means to keep them at bay. King Tommen appears trapped, as the High Sparrow exerts influence through the people. The Tyrells offer tentative support to Tommen, but they fear involving themselves too deeply. Meanwhile, there are rumors that Jaime Lannister may move to quell the faith by force." Peter tapped a finger on the table. "And Varys? Is the spider still abroad?" The agent hesitated. "Yes, my lord. He seems to be operating near Dragonstone, possibly in contact with Targaryen forces, if the rumors hold weight. Our sources say he's maintaining a network of informants that extends across the Narrow Sea. We suspect he's positioning himself behind Daenerys Targaryen's claim." Peter nodded, absorbing the information. King's Landing fractures, the Lannisters weaken, the Tyrells waver, the spider scuttles toward the Dragon Queen. Perfect. The agent watched him carefully. "Then you see an opportunity?" Peter allowed a small smile. "I do. Thank you. Send word to our contacts in the capital to remain vigilant. Continue fostering unrest between the faith militant and Cersei. Have them whisper that perhaps the Tyrells might be safer forging a new alliance rather than risking destruction with the Lannisters." He paused. "And keep a close eye on Marjorie Tyrell. If she stumbles or is threatened, The Tyrells might break from Tommen's cause in search of a new protector. The agent bowed and departed with quick, silent steps. Peter rose from his seat and crossed to the window, gazing out into the swirling night. He imagined, in the far distance, King's Landing roiling with hidden chaos. He thought of the Targaryen girl forging alliances in the south. He pictured the Boltons in Winterfell, sitting on a precarious seat of flayed skins. All roads were leading to a new conflict, an endgame no one had fully envisioned. No one but him, if all went according to plan. He pictured a crown resting upon his head. Many would laugh at the image. A crown for Littlefinger, the master of coin turned petty lord. The boy from the fingers? But if there was one truth in Westeros, it was that the improbable happened more often than people like to believe, especially when orchestrated by a cunning hand. The next move was to publicly declare for the North. The Vale would ride north to restore Sansa Stark to her rightful seat. In doing so, Baelish would position himself as a champion of justice and the old ways. The Northern Bannermen, tired of Bolton cruelty, would flock to Sansa's banner. And if a time came to cross swords with the Boltons, so be it. The Vale's knights were fresh from minimal involvement in the war, and Peter could count on them to deliver a swift victory if he chose the moment carefully. Yet, he would not simply march blindly on Winterfell. That would be foolish and costly. Instead, he would encourage the Boltons' enemies, wildlings, Skagos rebels, White Harbor Knights, scattered loyalists to the Starks, to harry the Boltons first. The Boltons' defenses would weaken, their resources would strain. Then the Vale Knights would march in at the opportune moment, rescue the day, and install Sansa as Lady of Winterfell. Once the North was secure, the question was how to move south. By then, Peter expected the Lannisters and Tyrells to be at each other's throats or entangled with the Faith militant. Daenerys Targaryen might attempt to claim the throne, but her success was far from guaranteed. Even with dragons, she needed the cooperation of noble houses, or at least their fear. Peter intended to sow enough doubt and dissension that her path would not be so straightforward. Meanwhile, in the face of rising chaos, the realm might recall that the Vale and North were the only stable, unified forces left. That was the narrative he intended to seed throughout Westeros. On a particularly frigid morning, ravens were sent from the Eyrie to every holdfast in the Vale. The letters were signed by Peter Baelish, Lord Protector of the Vale, and Sansa Stark, the last known heir of Eddard Stark. They called upon the Knights of the Vale to assemble in defense of a lady wronged, to restore justice in the North and unseat the false lords who had betrayed the realm's trust. There was no explicit mention of future crowns or bigger ambitions. It was framed as a matter of honor, of retribution for the murder of Lady Lisa Arryn and the torment of an innocent Stark girl. The Vale lords, many of whom were already indebted or beholden to Baelish, complied without public protest. Their knights began to gather at the gates of the moon. In the Eyries' great hall, Peter stood before a small assembly, Sansa by his side. The herald announced the formal reading of the letters, proclaiming that the Vale would ride in defense of the true Lady of Winterfell. Applause followed, tempered by curiosity. The men who had once been fiercely loyal to House Arryn found themselves championing the Stark cause, but their confidence in Baelish had grown from months of well-placed rewards and fear of the alternative. Sansa, standing as tall as she could in the face of so many gazes, bore the outward composure of a budding ruler. Peter noticed her hands trembling lightly at her sides. He surreptitiously placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder as the ceremony concluded. She turned slightly, meeting his eyes, and though her expression was unreadable, she did not shy away. Afterward, the Vale lords and knights departed to muster their forces for the slow trek north. Peter retired to his private chambers, beckoning Sansa to follow. Once the doors were closed, he poured her a cup of spiced wine, the steam curling around the rim. She accepted it with a hesitant nod, but she did not drink immediately. "So it begins?" she murmured, breaking the silence. "Are we truly going to fight the Boltons?" Peter sipped his own wine. "If it comes to that. But with luck, the Boltons will be isolated before we even cross the neck. There is deep hatred for them in the north. If enough houses rise up, Houses Manderley, Serwyn, Hornwood, Glover, and more, the Boltons will find themselves besieged. Then the Vale arrives, helps deliver the final blow. The North recognizes you, the rightful daughter of Eddard Stark, as Lady of Winterfell. She seemed lost in thought. And I'll have my home again. He nodded slowly. Yes, and a home for those who are loyal to you, for the Vale, and for me as well, one hopes. She tilted her head. You speak as if we are to rule together. But do not kings or queens rule with kings or queens? A Lady of Winterfell? Is that all? He could hear the question in her tone. She was more astute than she once was, but still uncertain. You are not wrong, my dear, he said softly. But first we must walk before we run. Winterfell must be secured. The North must be restabilized. The rest will become clear in time. Westeros is heading for another crisis of leadership. My goal is to ensure you and I are on the winning side of that crisis, no matter what shape it takes. She took a small sip of the spiced wine, her brow furrowed. I don't want more war, Peter. I've seen enough of it. I've seen too much suffering. He placed a hand gently atop hers. No one wants war, my dear, but to live in this world, we sometimes must bear arms to protect what is ours, to reclaim what has been taken. Once the North is stable, we can work to bring peace. But only once we've both secured our positions. And trust me, once we do, you will have the power to protect those you love and spare many from further bloodshed. She exhaled and set down her cup. You make it sound almost noble. I only hope it is not as bloody as I fear. Peter's voice softened to a whisper, as though weaving a lullaby for a frightened child. Sansa, in the Game of Thrones, we move in shadows. We kill with whispers and deals, not just with swords. If I can orchestrate events in such a way that open war is minimized, I shall do so. Believe me, I have no desire to waste our knights or the men of the North if I can avoid it. He was telling part of the truth. A smaller war was easier to manage than a large one. Less messy. She stared into the firelight, her expression distant. After a moment, she nodded. Then let it be so. The days that followed saw column after column of Vale Knights descending the mountain passes, traveling with wagons of supplies to last the winter. Peter stayed close to Sansa, ensuring she presented a composed face to the lords as they rode. Word of the Vale's impending intervention in the North spread quickly. Whispers traveled faster than ravens, carried by merchants, travelers, and the occasional sellsword. Meanwhile, Peter's spies continued their work in King's Landing, fanning the flames of discord between the faith militant and the royal court. In the Riverlands, old tensions reignited among the remnants of House Tully's supporters, further complicating the Lannisters' ability to march north unimpeded. The Freys were dealing with their own troubles, disliked by nearly all their neighbors. The chaos was deepening, just as Peter had intended. At the cusp of winter, Peter and Sansa left the Eyrie behind. They traveled with a retinue of knights, riding at the head of a formation that snaked around the high roads. The wind roared through the peaks, and snow dusted their cloaks. Sansa wore a thick mantle of fur that offset her auburn hair, giving her a regal look that made Baelish proud. He could already see how the northern lords would hail her as the reincarnation of her mother's beauty combined with the Stark lineage. Standing next to her, a sly mockingbird pinned to his doublet, Peter Baelish felt a thrill of anticipation. He had spent years prodding and pushing the realm toward this moment. All that remained was to see if the final strokes would paint the picture he desired. Upon reaching the Bloody Gate, the passage that guarded the entrance to the Vale, the company paused. The gate's defenders, men loyal to House Arryn, bowed to Peter, acknowledging his authority as Lord Protector. They offered tribute to Lady Sansa as well, calling her My Lady and Lady Stark. She nodded politely, but Peter sensed the flicker of emotion behind her eyes. This was the first time in years she had been acknowledged openly by her true name and title. Once the gate opened, the column moved forward into the rolling hills that marked the edge of the Vale, beyond which lay the winding path to the Riverlands and eventually the north. Their journey took weeks, slowed by harsh weather and the necessity of sending out scouts to secure safe passage. They chose routes that bypassed major Lannister-controlled roads, mindful of not provoking a large-scale confrontation. Petyr had no desire to challenge the Iron Throne just yet. Better to let them worry about the faith-militant and Targaryen threats. As the Vale's host advanced, smaller northern forces, men loyal to the memory of the Starks, met them with cautious respect. Over time, these groups swelled the Vale's numbers as they drew closer to Moat Cailin, the ancient fortress that guarded the Neck. When they finally reached Moat Cailin, Petyr had cause to be pleased. The ruined fortress was manned by a token force loyal to the Boltons, but that force was meager and poorly supplied. They did not resist openly. Instead, they scattered or attempted to parley, powerless to stand against the Vale's knights and the northern bannermen who had joined Sansa's cause. Petyr allowed most of them to flee. He had no need for needless slaughter. Sansa, flanked by Baelish and a handful of local lords from White Harbor and Deepwood Motte, examined the towers that jutted out of the swampy ground. The stench of stagnant water hung heavy in the cold air. Petyr watched her carefully. She seemed steadier, more certain than she had at the start of their journey. "We should move onward," she said with quiet resolve. "Let us finish this. I want to see Winterfell again." He nodded. Indeed, Winterfell awaits. He knew that the Boltons would not relinquish the castle without a fight. Reports suggested that Ramsay Bolton was still in command. If they marched directly on Winterfell, a siege might be inevitable. But Petyr had not orchestrated all these months of planning just to settle in for a protracted siege. His spies had been at work. Several northern lords who had once bent the knee to the Boltons were prepared to betray them. The Manderleys were moving from White Harbor, capturing small holdfasts. The Boltons' grip on the region was slipping by the day. Still, Ramsay Bolton was infamous for his cruelty, and he held captives. Some whispered he might have Rickon Stark, Sansa's youngest brother, though rumors of Rickon Stark's whereabouts had been inconsistent for years. If that rumor were true, it might complicate Sansa's claim. Yet Petyr had a plan for that as well. If Rickon Stark lived and was produced, Petyr could spin the narrative in Sansa's favor. If Rickon proved uncooperative, well, accidents happened in war. A fortnight later, the Vale host stood a few leagues from Winterfell. Snow fell thickly, and the sun was a pale disk behind gray clouds. Petyr surveyed the castle walls in the distance. Once proud and held by House Stark, the fortress had endured siege and ruin, only to be rebuilt partially by the Boltons. From this vantage, columns of smoke rose from inside the walls, and the silhouette of the castle ramparts cut a jagged line against the wintry sky. Scouts returned with reports of Bolton defenses. Ramsay had mustered what men he could. A mixture of Bolton soldiers, some reluctant northern levies, and a handful of Sellswords. Their numbers, however, were dwarfed by the combined Vale and northern forces loyal to Sansa. Desperation might drive Ramsay to sally forth or attempt some vile trick. Petyr was prepared for both. When negotiations opened, Petyr sent an envoy to request the peaceful surrender of Winterfell to Lady Sansa Stark. Ramsay's reply came in the form of a severed head of the envoy's horse, delivered outside the camp. Alongside it was a parchment scrawled in blood. "Come and see," a typical demonstration of Ramsay's brand of cruelty. Sansa turned pale at the sight, but she did not falter. Petyr convened with the leading northern lords, forming a plan for the assault. They would encircle Winterfell, secure the roads, and starve the Boltons. Meanwhile, Petyr's men inside the castle, bribed guards, a few sympathetic northern servants, would sabotage the defenses. With careful coordination, they might force an internal collapse. Petyr intended to avoid a lengthy siege if possible, but he was fully willing to deploy it as a tactic to wear Ramsay down. However, the day after they encircled the castle, something unexpected occurred. The gates of Winterfell opened, and a small column of riders emerged under a white banner of truce. Leading them was none other than Roose Bolton himself, alive despite rumors that Ramsay might have turned on him. He rode toward the Vale lines, flanked by a handful of grim-faced men. Petyr, with Sansa at his side, stepped forward as Bolton halted. The northern lords present tensed in anticipation, many with hands on their sword hilts. Roose Bolton's voice carried across the snow. "We wish to negotiate," he said, glancing at Sansa. His tone was as cold as the air around them. "We see you have the advantage in numbers, but you should remember the consequences of an open battle. Winter is here, and many will die on both sides before the day is through." Sansa's voice cracked but steadied. "You have no right to Winterfell," she declared, words echoing with the ancient authority of House Stark. "You murdered my brother. You betrayed my family." Bolton's eyes flicked to Peter. "And you? Lord Baelish, you served the crown once. Are you now a traitor to the Iron Throne, aiding this rebellion?" Peter's composure never wavered. "I serve the Vale, and the Vale does not recognize your claim. You stand against the rightful Lady of Winterfell and her bannermen. Surrender now, and you may be allowed to leave with your life. Resist, and I guarantee it will be short and unpleasant." Bolton's gaze shifted between the assembled knights and the mass of northern men. He spoke slowly, carefully. "Let us be reasonable. If we are to fall, we will make certain you pay dearly. Ramsay is not patient. He will not hesitate to burn what remains of Winterfell rather than surrender it. And if the rest of the realm sees the Vale forging open rebellion, the Iron Throne will respond." Peter offered a cool smile. "We do not fear the Iron Throne." Then his voice dropped a note. "They have enough problems of their own, I assure you. And as for burning Winterfell, do you think your few men can hold off this siege indefinitely? You'll freeze or starve before we do." A silence fell. Snow drifted between them, dancing on the wind. Bolton finally spoke, a calculated edge to his words. "Would you see your precious Lady Stark's brother killed? We have Rickon Stark in our custody. If you storm these walls, we will slaughter him." Sansa's face went pallid. Peter watched her reaction. Bolton's statement forced her hand, but Peter had prepared for this possibility. If Rickon were truly inside, he was a liability. But if used correctly, he was also a symbol that might unite the North. Peter let silence linger for a moment, letting Bolton believe. He held a trump card. Then Peter raised an eyebrow. "You expect us to believe Rickon Stark is alive? You claim this because you hope we'll hesitate. Show us the boy alive and we might negotiate terms. Otherwise, we continue as planned, and your threats ring hollow." Bolton's face darkened. He beckoned to one of his riders, who produced a small, shivering figure. At first glance, it seemed like a boy, wrapped in a cloak. The rider pulled the cloak back, revealing tangled hair and frightened eyes. Even from a distance, one could see the likeness to Sansa in certain features. It was Rickon Stark indeed. He looked half-starved, cold, and terrified. A collective murmur rose from the northern bannermen. They recognized the boy. They muttered curses against the Boltons. Sansa stood rooted, tears glistening in her eyes. That was her little brother, the child she had thought lost. Bolton gave a thin-lipped smile. "Now you see I speak truth. If you attack, he dies." For a fraction of a second, Peter Baelish considered the ramifications. If Rickon Stark lived and was freed, the North might see him as the true heir to Winterfell, outranking Sansa by primogeniture's rules. He was a male heir, after all. That could complicate Peter's plan to govern through Sansa. However, if Rickon were killed now, the North's outrage would still benefit Sansa's cause, but it would weigh heavily on her conscience and possibly fracture her trust in Peter if he did not at least attempt to save the boy. And if Rickon survived, Peter would adapt. The boy could be shaped or marginalized. He turned to Sansa, whose expression was pleading. He could see it in her eyes. They had to save Rickon at any cost. She had lost too much family already. Peter weighed the cost of betraying her trust. That price was too high. He had invested too much in her as a figurehead for the North. He faced Bolton again. "What are your terms?" Bolton's eyes glinted with dark victory. "We remain the wardens of the North. The boy lives. The Lady Stark may remain here as a guest, under our careful watch, with the Vale returning to the Eyrie and no further interference." Sansa's expression flared with anger, but Peter placed a calming hand on her arm. "Impossible terms," he replied, shaking his head. "The Northern Bannermen will never stand for it. nor will the veil after what has transpired." He paused, letting Bolton consider. "But there may be a middle ground. Release the boy. We will allow you to leave Winterfell with your men and your lives, and we will grant you safe passage to the Dreadfort, if you prefer. From there, you may hold your seat and keep your heads, so long as you never again claim Winterfell. Should you refuse, we attack. The results, well, you can guess." Bolton's face contorted with fury. "You presume to negotiate from your self-proclaimed position of power. But consider that once we kill the boy, you lose a valuable symbol. You lose a true Stark male. Sansa's claim will always be overshadowed by those who question whether a woman should hold Winterfell. This alone should give you pause." Peter matched his glare with quiet poise. "We have Sansa. The people love the memory of her father. If you kill Rickon, the Boltons become the most hated house in the north. You will be hunted to extinction. Your men know this, and so do you." The tension was palpable. Bolton glanced back toward the castle, possibly wondering what the cost of continuing was. If he retreated now, House Bolton might survive, albeit as a diminished power. If he refused, he gambled everything on a final confrontation. Peter could guess that Ramsay would never accept a compromise. But Roose was more pragmatic. He had always been one to weigh advantage over pride. Bolton's voice rasped low. "I need time to consult with my son." Peter dipped his head. "Very well. You have until morning. After that, our patience ends." Bolton snapped the reins, turning his horse. The small party rode back inside the castle, the gates shutting behind them with a clang. Rickon was taken with them. Sansa turned to Peter, desperation in her eyes. "We can't let them take him back inside. They'll kill him anyway, or harm him, just to punish us." Peter placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They won't risk it yet. Killing him now would leave them with no leverage to bargain. I will see if my men inside can intervene, though it is risky. But fear not, we'll do all we can." She pressed her lips together and nodded, tears welling. "All this time, he's been alive. I can't fail him." Peter drew her close, a gesture that he made sure others saw, as if to appear a comforting father figure. His mind, however, churned through strategies. If the Boltons refused to surrender, the simplest approach might be a swift assault or infiltration. He had men inside who could open a gate at the right moment or sabotage the defenses. But that still put Rickon's life at risk. That night, Peter held council with the Northern Lords and Vale Knights. Some favored an immediate assault, but Peter insisted on waiting for Bolton's response, if only to buy time for infiltration. After the meeting, Peter slipped out of his tent to a secluded area of the camp, where one of his informants waited. The informant, a slight man with a battered cloak, had snuck out from Winterfell earlier in the evening. "The boy is kept under heavy guard," the informant whispered. "Ramsay has threatened to kill him if he hears any rumor of treachery inside the walls. He's posted loyal men at key points. Smug bastards. But we've prepared a chance if you want to attempt a rescue." Peter considered the ramifications. A stealthy rescue might avert the need for negotiation altogether. But if it failed, Rickon would almost certainly be killed. And if it succeeded, they could storm the castle with no fear for the boy's life. The Northern Lords would be incensed, and the Boltons' morale would crumble. Peter's mind balanced the odds. "When? Tomorrow night or any night soon. We have 2 men near the kennels who can slip the boy out if they get the signal. We just need to ensure the Boltons' attention is elsewhere." Peter nodded, exhaling a thin breath into the cold night air. "Very well. Prepare it. I'll give you final confirmation before dawn." The informant slipped away, vanishing into the darkness. Peter remained still, letting the cold numb him for a moment. In the morning, Bolton would give his answer. If Bolton agreed to surrender Winterfell in exchange for safe passage, Rickon would be freed. That would be the less bloody outcome. But if Bolton refused, Peter would authorize the infiltration. Morning came with the wind howling and the snow thick. Peter, Sansa, and the assembled forces awaited Bolton's response. By mid-morning, no envoy emerged from the castle. By midday, ravens soared overhead, but none brought tidings of capitulation. Peter began to suspect that Ramsay had convinced Roose to make a stand or some cunning ploy was in motion. At dusk, when the sun slipped behind the walls, a solitary figure on horseback came forth from Winterfell. It was one of Bolton's men, clad in furs, leading a riderless horse behind him. He stopped just beyond arrow range, shouting at the camp. Bolton's terms. Bend the knee to the Warden of the North or die. We have the Stark boy, and we are not afraid to end his line. Your time is up. Peter felt Sansa tense beside him. The messenger turned and rode away before any could answer. That was confirmation enough. As the shadows lengthened, Peter withdrew to a secluded spot and summoned the informant once more. Do it tonight, he instructed. Cause a distraction. Let the men inside the walls create confusion. Rescue Rickon. Our host will be ready to storm the castle once the gates open or the guards are in disarray. The informant nodded and departed. Peter returned to the command tent, where the Northern Lords and Vale Knights gathered. He laid out the plan. At midnight, an attack would begin to draw the Bolton forces to the ramparts. Under cover of this assault, the infiltrators inside would free Rickon and signal for the gates to be opened. If all went well, the Vale forces would sweep in, capturing the castle with minimal bloodshed. Sansa listened in silence, her face pale but resolute. He caught her eye as the meeting ended, and she stepped aside with him. You're risking Rickon's life, she said quietly. If something goes wrong, he held her gaze. If we do nothing, the Boltons will surely kill him eventually or hold him hostage forever. This is our best chance. Trust me. She swallowed hard. I do, she whispered. When midnight approached, the snow had lessened but the wind still bit fiercely. The Vale Knights stood in tense lines, torches flickering in the darkness. Northern bannermen, eager for vengeance, readied themselves beside them. Peter moved among them, offering quiet words of encouragement. They saw him as the orchestrator of this rescue, a man who had brought them Lady Stark. Some were uneasy about his southern origins, but gold and opportunity often quieted such doubts. A horn blew, low and resonant, and the assault began. Arrows lit with pitch soared over the walls, streaking the sky with smoky trails. Bolton archers retaliated, their arrows whistling through the cold air. On the ramparts, torches bobbed as men rushed to defensive positions. The clang of metal on metal soon echoed across the courtyard. Peter stationed himself on a small rise with a clear view of the gates. Around him, guards protected Sansa. She refused to stay completely hidden, wanting to witness the moment Winterfell might be freed. For a time, the cacophony of battle filled the night. Shouts, screams, the pounding of hooves in the mud and snow. Peter's gaze stayed pinned on the massive doors that barred entry to the castle. If the infiltration succeeded, those doors would open soon. If it failed, minutes felt like hours. Then, suddenly, a cry rose from the ramparts. Flames flickered in an unexpected spot, as if some part of the wall had been set alight from within. Peter recognized the signal. A moment later, a commotion at the gate. The bars drew up, and a portion of the doors swung ajar. A roar went up from the attacking forces. This was their chance. Knights spurred their horses forward. Footmen charged, brandishing swords and shields. Peter watched the gates widen, and the silhouettes of men fighting on the other side. Then, among the chaos, he caught sight of a smaller form, led by two men. Even from a distance, he could tell it was a boy with stark features, stumbling but being half-dragged to safety. Rickon. Sansa let out a sharp exclamation. They have him. Peter held her arm, half to reassure her and half to keep her from rushing in. Wait, he said. We must let our men secure the way first. The chaos intensified as the gates were fully breached. Bolton soldiers scrambled to hold them, but they were outnumbered and disorganized. Some began to flee deeper into the castle. Once the Vale cavalry surged inside the courtyard, the defenders broke. Shouts of, "For the Starks!" and "Winterfell!" echoed over the tumult. Peter guided Sansa forward, flanked by guards. They entered through the battered gate and found themselves in a courtyard strewn with bodies. The snow tinged pink from torchlight and blood. She looked around, her expression pained. Peter signaled to the men in front, who parted to reveal Rickon standing there, shivering and frightened. One of Peter's informants handed the boy over. Sansa rushed to Rickon, enfolding him in her arms. She wept openly now, tears freezing on her cheeks. He clung to her as if scarcely believing he was free. Peter watched the reunion with a practiced neutrality. Another Stark in their midst, a powerful symbol, both an asset and a risk. He would manage it. Meanwhile, the Vale Knights continued to secure the castle. The Bolton banners were torn down. Men loyal to House Stark rushed to proclaim victory. Where were the Boltons themselves? Peter suspected Ramsay might make a last stand or try to flee. But soon enough, a group of Manderley men dragged a struggling figure into the courtyard, thrusting him to the ground. It was Ramsay Bolton, battered and snarling, his eyes full of manic hatred. Before Peter or Sansa could speak, one of the Manderley knights spat on Ramsay. "It's over, bastard," he growled. "Your men are dead or fled. We found your father's body in the Great Hall, knifed in the back. It seems no one left to protect you." Ramsay lifted his head, blood trickling from his temple, and fixed his gaze on Sansa. A cruel smile twisted his lips. "Hello, Lady Stark. Did you miss me?" His eyes flickered to Rickon. "And you, little pup, you're still alive? I'll have to correct that." With a sharp nod, Peter signaled the guards, who clamped a gag in Ramsay's mouth. Sansa trembled, not entirely from the cold. She stepped forward, her face set. "He's mine to decide," she said firmly, looking to Peter and the other lords. Peter nodded slowly. He understood the gesture. Ramsay had tormented her family. It was her right. She stared down at Ramsay, who glared back with a mixture of defiance and madness. "You die tonight," she pronounced in a voice that quavered only slightly. "For what you did to my family, for the evil you brought upon these halls, for what you did to Rickon." She hesitated, then steeled herself. "And for what you did to me." Peter watched her, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. Sansa had found a strength within herself. Where once she might have been too timid to utter such a sentence, she now stood in the half-ruined courtyard of her ancestral home, condemning her tormentor. Ramsay tried to speak, but the gag reduced his words to muffled growls. One of the northern lords lifted a sword, seeking Sansa's approval. She nodded grimly. The man swung, swift and unhesitating, severing Ramsay's head from his shoulders. Blood spilled onto the snow, and the body slumped. It was done. A hush fell, broken only by the crackle of distant fires. Sansa closed her eyes for a moment, then turned to Peter and Rickon. Peter placed a hand gently on Rickon's shoulder. The boy flinched but did not pull away. In that moment, Peter saw the entire north stretching before him. Winterfell was reclaimed by the Starks, symbolized by these two siblings. The Boltons were finished. Word would spread swiftly. House Stark had returned, backed by the Vale. The northern lords would rally to them wholeheartedly, for the nightmares inflicted by the Boltons were finally at an end. That same night, a makeshift ceremony took place in the Great Hall of Winterfell. Sansa and Rickon sat at the high table, while the northern lords and Vale Knights paid homage. They swore to restore Winterfell to its former glory, to unite under House Stark once more. Peter stood behind Sansa, an ever-watchful sentinel. The name Baelish was seldom spoken, but he was the power behind this restoration. Sansa called for the burned and tattered Stark banners to be retrieved from storage, and soon they were draped once more in the hall, overshadowing the flayed man sigils that were dragged out and burned in the courtyard. It was a triumphant sight, a potent image that would spread throughout the north. As the night wore on, Peter orchestrated celebrations among the men to bolster morale. Drums and lutes echoed through the courtyard, and the once gloomy walls of Winterfell came alive with torches and firelight. Northern hospitality blended with the Vale's more refined celebrations. It was a precarious harmony, but for this night at least it felt like hope. In a quiet moment, when the celebrations had lulled, Peter slipped away from the hall and ascended the winding stairs to the upper floors, where many rooms remained cold and unoccupied. He found one that overlooked the courtyard, from which he could see the flickering fires below. He stood there in the darkness, the chill creeping through the stone floors, reflecting upon what had been achieved. He had promised Sansa that reclaiming Winterfell was only the beginning, and it was true. Now the question was how to leverage the victory to take the next step, to crown himself king. That would require cunning and care, for the Stark name was ascendant here, not Baelish. But with Sansa and Rickon both dependent on him, and the Vale loyal to him, he had a foothold. A movement behind him made him turn. It was Sansa, wrapped in a heavy cloak, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. She looked exhausted, but there was a certain glow in her features now, a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. "The castle feels bigger than I remember," she murmured, stepping up beside him. "So much of it is empty or damaged. But it's still Winterfell." He nodded, smiling faintly. "Yes, it's yours again. You and Rickon can rebuild. You can restore the glory of your house." She stared at him, her expression uncertain. "You helped us do this. You brought me here, helped me save my brother." Thank you, Peter." He reached for her hand, and she allowed it. "All I ask is your faith in me. The realm is in chaos, but House Stark and the Vale stand strong. Together, we can achieve so much more." She did not withdraw her hand. "You've done so much already, and yet there's a feeling I can't shake that you have a far larger plan. I'm afraid of what it might be." He exhaled, the faintest smile on his lips. "My plan is simple, my dear. The realm is fracturing. The Lannisters lose their grip. Targaryens come with fire and blood. The Tyrells scheme in the south. If the North and the Vale stand united, and if we choose our moments wisely, we can ensure stability. The small folk cry out for a leader, for a realm not ruled by tyranny or madness. Our victory here could be just the beginning." She searched his face. "And how does that end with you on a throne?" He blinked, a flash of surprise crossing his features. For a moment, he considered lying, spinning yet another half-truth. But seeing her there, in the dim moonlight, having reclaimed her home, he felt a strange inclination to be honest, or as close to honesty as he could manage. "I was once nothing," he admitted softly. "A boy mocked for his small estate, humiliated by lords who held all the power in their fists. I swore I would never be powerless again. The Iron Throne, it represents the ultimate power in Westeros. In my hands, it could also be a force for a better realm, for order. I have the cunning to hold it without letting it consume me. Others have tried and failed. I will not fail." Her hand tensed in his. "You think the North would accept you as king?" He paused. "Alone, no. But with the rightful Lady of Winterfell at my side, beloved by the North for her father's legacy. The Vale, grateful for my leadership, the Riverlands, who may remember my Tully connections, we might have a chance. If it comes to it, if the realm is in such turmoil that no other candidate can hold it together, I can step in. And so can you." She hesitated, pulling her hand away gently. "You say it as if it's so easy. But what about Rickon? He's the true heir. And what about the North's traditions? They won't bow to a Southron lord so quickly." Peter was not surprised by her resistance. He made his voice gentle. "It won't be immediate. Rickon is still a child. He needs guidance. The North needs leadership that can deal with the rest of the realm. And you, Sansa, you have a claim here, but that does not mean you must remain merely a lady in the North. You have the right to seek more, to protect your people from the storms to come." She looked away, gazing at the torches in the cour. "Tired below. I'm not sure if that's what I want." He nodded, stepping closer. "Think of all the suffering we could prevent if we bring stability. You've seen the cruelty of kings and queens who lack our understanding. Joffrey, Cersei, the Boltons. They've caused unimaginable pain. We can do better. We can shape a future that spares others such horrors." She closed her eyes, inhaling the icy air. When she spoke, her voice was tinged with weariness. "Let's rebuild Winterfell first. Let's make the North safe. Then we can talk of thrones." He inclined his head. "As you wish, my lady." They stood together for another moment, silent. Then she turned and left, her footsteps echoing in the corridor. Peter remained by the window, allowing himself a moment of private reflection. Sansa might resist the idea now, but he believed she would come to see the necessity of taking the crown, or at least supporting him when the time was right. He had waited years, decades, to climb to the apex of power. A few more months or years would not deter him. In the days that followed, the news of the Boltons' fall spread like wildfire. Many northern lords traveled to Winterfell to swear fealty to House Stark once more. They brought supplies, men, and crucially, the loyalty that Sansa needed to re-establish a functioning seat of power. Meanwhile, ravens flew from Winterfell to the Vale, confirming the victory. Baelish remained at Winterfell, subtly guiding matters of governance, forging new alliances, and distributing coin in strategic ways. He also received word from King's Landing that things had deteriorated further. Cersei Lannister stood accused of multiple crimes, and the Tyrells were splitting from Tommen's cause, outraged by the Faith militants' power. Rumor said Jaime Lannister had marched away, possibly heading north or to the Riverlands. The Iron Throne was weaker than ever. Likewise, Daenerys Targaryen had taken important strongholds in the Stormlands. Dragons were rumored to have scorched entire columns of opposing forces. Fear rippled across the realm, but in the north, winter storms and distance kept them safe for the moment. Peter watched these developments carefully, sending his own agents south to spread tales of the savage destruction wrought by the dragons, hoping to turn lords against Daenerys out of fear. Soon, he would need to make his move. The north was secure under Stark rule, with him as the power behind the curtain. The Vale was firmly under his control. The Riverlands were in disarray, but he had roots there and could exploit the Tully name. If the Lannisters and Tyrells collapsed in on themselves, and if the realm looked for a savior against the Targaryen threat, Peter Baelish could position himself as the king who united north and south. He bided his time quietly but diligently. The first snows of winter were thick. Armies would not move far until spring, and by then the situation in the south might be ripe for him to strike. He would gather the north and the Vale, perhaps even the Riverlands, forging a confederation that could face the Targaryens. If Daenerys wanted the Iron Throne, she would have to contend with a new king in the north. In the hush of one snowy evening, he wandered through the crypts beneath Winterfell. He moved with a lantern, flickering shadows dancing on the stone statues of Starks gone by. Eddard Stark's likeness stood solemnly, brandishing a sword on his lap. Peter paused before the statue, gazing at the stern face carved into the rock. A swirl of contradictory emotions welled inside him. He had both envied and admired Ned Stark. He had hated him for his honor, for the love Catelyn had held for him. He had even respected him for his unwavering morals. Now, Peter was about to claim the legacy that man had died for, House Stark restored, Winterfell reclaimed, and more. It was a triumph laced with irony. He reached out and placed a hand on the cold stone. "Rest easy, Lord Stark," he murmured softly into the gloom. "Your children are safe now, and soon the realm will be mine to shape. Perhaps I shall even shape it into something you might have approved of. Or perhaps not. But one thing is certain. I will not squander this chance." His voice echoed, hollow and haunting, in the crypt. He turned and left, footsteps fading into the darkness, leaving the silent statues to witness his departure. Weeks became months. The north stabilized under the watchful guidance of Sansa and Peter. Rickon recovered from his captivity, but he remained wary, still a child shaped by fear and uncertainty. Peter carefully ensured Rickon's guardians reported to him, so the boy would view him as a distant but benevolent figure. In time, Rickon might be married off in a strategic alliance, or remain overshadowed if Peter and Sansa rose to the throne. Meanwhile, the Vale Lords remained stationed in or around Winterfell, forging new bonds with their northern counterparts. Peter made sure to keep them well compensated and flattered. Their knights patrolled the roads, guaranteeing stability in a region once ravaged by war and tyranny. Local smallfolk welcomed the new rule, seeing that they were safer under Lady Stark and the Vale's knights than they had been under the Boltons. Slowly, pieces fell into place. The final strokes of Petyr Baelish's plan loomed on the horizon. The north, the Vale, a portion of the Riverlands, these he could unify. Then, as the south devoured itself in the chaos of Lannisters versus Tyrells and Targaryens, Petyr would march as the only stable alternative. He would arrive not as a usurper, but as the solution to the realm's woes. The small folk would rally to him, the lords would see him as the lesser of evils, and the Targaryens might falter if their dragons alone could not subjugate the entire continent. All that was left was a spark to ignite the final crisis. Petyr had a plan for that spark, too. Agents in King's Landing spread rumors of Lannister atrocities, provoking further uprisings of the faith militant. In the Reach, whispers suggested Daenerys aimed to burn the fields and storehouses if the Tyrells did not submit, stirring panic among lesser lords who might look for a northern alliance as a safer harbor. In the end, the realm would cry out for a leader, and Petyr Baelish would provide one himself. The quiet mockingbird would ascend to a throne built on the ashes of prideful lions, fiery dragons, and rotted iron chairs. A new king would rise, unheralded in prophecy, but unstoppable in cunning. And so, in the heart of Winterfell, as the cold winds howled across the battlements, Petyr Baelish stood upon the cusp of making the impossible real. He had orchestrated the downfall of once mighty houses, championed the revival of House Stark, and now set his sights on something far greater. He had sown the seeds of chaos, ensuring every potential rival was entangled in conflict or divided by suspicion. His next steps would be subtle, decisive, and final. One day, soon, a coronation would take place, not in the Red Keep, but perhaps in the grand halls of Winterfell, or maybe even at the Eyrie. Wherever he chose, the Seven Kingdoms would be forced to acknowledge Petyr Baelish, the cunning lord who had crowned himself king, forging a new dynasty out of the rubble of old ambitions. All the while, the haunting wail of the northern wind would echo off the towers, whispering a stark reminder that winter had come, and with it, a king like none Westeros had ever known. Night settled over Winterfell with a wind that howled like a distant wolf pack, scouring the battlements and whispering through shattered corners of the castle still in need of repair. Petyr Baelish stood alone on a crumbling walkway, gazing out over the snowy courtyard where torches guttered in iron sconces. The winter sky was thick with clouds, blanketing the moon, but the flicker of flames cast dancing shapes across the ramparts. Had one looked up at him in that moment, they might have seen only a slender silhouette with a mockingbird pin glinting at his breast. But behind that unassuming figure lay the sum of countless schemes, a tapestry of ambition stretching across kingdoms and years. In the yard below, Sansa Stark stood by her brother Rickon, guiding him through some simple matter, greeting newly arrived bannermen, perhaps, or walking him around to reacquaint him with Winterfell's spaces. The poor boy had grown up amid turmoil, snatched away, then captive under Ramsay Bolton's cruelty. He was safe now, yet the haunted look in his eyes remained. Petyr could not hear the exchange, but he saw Sansa's gentle smile and Rickon's hesitant nod, and he imagined her words of reassurance. The North was healing. It happened slowly, as all rebuilding efforts did in winter. Stores were carefully rationed, hunting parties sent out daily, and small folk trickled back into abandoned villages once they heard the Boltons were dead and House Stark reestablished. Petyr observed it all with the keen eye of a man who recognized the power of rumor and symbolism. A starving populace was always dangerous, but a populace that believed in the promise of hope could endure. Sansa's mere presence at Winterfell, with her Stark features and name, provided a spark of that hope. A measured click of boots sounded behind him. One of his informants, a quiet, narrow-faced man named Roland, approached with a slight bow. Petyr turned, the wind snatching at the edge of his cloak. "My lord," Roland said softly. "More news from the south. A raven arrived an hour ago. The Lannisters' grip on King's Landing has all but fractured. Some say Tommen is but a figurehead, a boy forced to appease the faith militant. Cersei's influence wanes further each day. The Tyrells have half withdrawn their support after Marjorie's troubles with the High Sparrow. And Daenerys Targaryen, She has sacked half a dozen smaller loyalist holdfasts in the Stormlands, forcing them to bend the knee to her. Peter mulled the words, letting them swirl in his mind. The tyranny of dragons, as some were calling Daenerys' campaign, was as much rumor as reality, but the effect was immediate. Fear spread faster than ravens. As the Targaryen queen pressed inland, men saw visions of what Aegon's conquest might have looked like in earlier centuries. Houses that had never experienced dragonfire but had heard the old songs and stories believed that a single pass overhead could reduce them to cinders. It was precisely the environment Peter had hoped for, a widespread sense of crisis, waiting for someone to exploit it. And Jaime Lannister? Peter asked after a moment. Roland shifted on his feet. Sightings place him either in the Riverlands or near the Crownlands. Reports conflict. He might be trying to rally any loyalists left. But we know the Freys have grown weaker, and the Riverlands remain in disarray. House Tully's influence is still fractured. Many see the Lannisters as cursed after all the recent deaths and scandal. Peter considered this, remembering how crucial the Riverlands could be. He was from the Fingers, but his earliest stepping stones to power had been laid in the Tully household. He had once loved Catelyn Tully in his youth, or convinced himself of it. He had never quite abandoned the notion that the Riverlands might become his, if not by heritage, then by claim of influence. That door still stood ajar. If Jaime Lannister tried to regroup there, it could hamper Peter's plans or present an opportunity to remove Jaime as a piece on the board. "Send word to our sympathizers in the Riverlands," Peter instructed, his voice measured. "Emphasize that the North is united under House Stark once more, backed by the Vale's Knights. Let them know we have no quarrel with them, should they seek a safe alliance. And keep close watch on the Lannister movements. If Jaime Lannister attempts to muster men, I want timely warning." Roland inclined his head. "Yes, my lord, I will handle it at once." Then he hesitated, a flicker of hesitation passing over his features. "And the Targaryen threat? How do you wish to proceed with that?" Peter's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "We will deal with the Targaryens in time. For now, let rumors of their brutality spread freely. We can stoke them further, but be subtle. The more frightened the realm grows, the more they will look to the north for a savior." Roland nodded, gave a short bow, and departed into the night, leaving Peter alone again with his thoughts. He watched the courtyard until Sansa and Rickon disappeared inside, their torches bobbing around a corner. Then, quietly, he headed down the winding steps. The air was sharp with the promise of a deeper freeze. Soon, the courtyards would turn into slippery expanses of packed snow and ice. He knew time moved differently in winter. Armies halted, roads became treacherous, but politics never fully stopped. And Peter's game required that he keep stoking the embers of chaos in the south, even as the north lay blanketed in snow. Below, in the halls of Winterfell, torches burned steadily in iron brackets, and the stones underfoot still held a trace of the day's chill. He passed guards wearing Stark emblems. Many were men of the Vale, newly uniformed with dire wolf insignia. Some were Northerners loyal to Sansa, bearing an amalgamation of older Stark cloaks and pieces of Bolton armor dyed or repurposed. It was a mismatched force, but one that answered to Peter, even if they swore fealty to the Starks publicly. He reached the Great Hall. Though it had been partially damaged under the Boltons, enough repairs had been done that a modest feast could be held for guests. Several long tables remained arranged in neat rows, with benches on either side. At one of them sat Lady Sansa Stark, her expression thoughtful, a mug of mulled wine cradled between her hands. She looked up as he entered. "Lord Baelish," she greeted, echoing the formal address she offered in public. Though alone, she might sometimes call him Peter. "You're restless tonight." He approached, graceful as always, and settled at the bench across from her. "Restlessness is my nature, my lady. There's always something to plan, a new alliance to broker, a problem to solve." She sipped her wine. Her hair was drawn up in a thick braid, and the glow of the nearby fire caught the subtle coppery highlights. "I've been speaking to the Glover men," she said. "They fear that if the Targaryens press north, will be outmatched, dragons or no. They want to fortify the Moat Cailin Road and call on the Knights of the Vale to bolster the defenses. I told them we'd consider it. Peter steepled his fingers. The Glovers are prudent to fear dragons. However, we have time. Daenerys Targaryen remains entangled in the Stormlands, if rumors are to be believed, and I doubt she'll cross half the realm in the dead of winter. Her resources, while formidable, are not unlimited. Her Dothraki do not relish cold climates, and even her dragons require substantial feeding. We can continue to fortify, of course, but panic would serve us poorly. Our best weapon remains patience, and the knowledge that the South unravels daily. Sansa nodded slowly. I know you keep saying the realm is in chaos, but chaos is often unpredictable. What if she forms a grand alliance? What if the Tyrells or Martells side with her? We can't fight that alone. Peter's eyes glimmered with the slightest hint of pride at her insight. She was learning to see beyond the immediate. We won't fight alone. We'll gather allies from the Riverlands, the Vale, and yes, perhaps even the Iron Islands if they feel threatened by dragons again. Remember, my lady, no alliance in Westeros is as straightforward as it appears. Even if the Tyrells proclaim loyalty to the Targaryens, they can be driven to doubt. A rumor here, an incitement there, and they'll question whether Daenerys truly intends to keep them as valued partners or treat them as subservient vassals. We'll ensure they never trust one another fully. She set down her mug, her gaze drifting toward the end of the hall where the massive Stark banners hung. Freshly sewn in some places, older in others. And if the Lannisters somehow claw their way back to power, they still hold the Iron Throne, officially. Peter nearly smirked. The Lannisters are a wounded beast, weak and bleeding. They may yet lash out, but they cannot sustain themselves alone. With Cersei at odds with the Faith and Tommen caught in the middle, their days are numbered. The Tyrells already question their alliance. The rest of the realm sees them for what they are, a house in decline. I expect them to fall quite soon, or be forced into subjugation by the Targaryens if they do not flee. Sansa's eyes flicked back to him. And then, who's left to unite the realm? If all the great houses have collapsed into ruin or are forced to kneel to Daenerys? He let the question hang in the warm air. A log crackled in the hearth behind him, throwing sparks into the shadows. Some might say the rightful family of the North, protected by the Vale's knights and the grateful river lords, he answered softly. But a northern queen alone might struggle to keep the South in line, unless she had a king consort with strategic ties, or an alternative monarchy that could appeal to lords who fear dragons and Lannister cruelty alike. Sansa's posture stiffened, and she took another drink of mulled wine before setting it aside. You're speaking of yourself as that alternative, aren't you? He did not deny it. Would that be so unthinkable? You and Rickon remain the figureheads of House Stark. The North belongs to you, and the Vale, through me, stands as your loyal partner. If the Targaryens become too fearsome, or if another Lannister emerges from the rubble, we would offer stability. The small folk don't care about names half as much as peace and prosperity. I can provide that with the right alliances. She studied him a moment, her expression unreadable. Yet you speak of alliances and negotiations as if they're pieces on a Syvas board. These are people's lives, Peter. Men, women, children who will bleed and starve in the wars we cause. He inclined his head. I do not deny the toll. But if a single war for unification saves them a generation of future conflict, is it not better? Look at what's happened over the last few years. The War of the Five Kings, the Bolton Terror in the north, the sacking of villages across the Riverlands, all of it culminating in thousands dead and millions more living in fear. I aim to prevent that from happening again under a stable rule. A rule we can guide, you and I. A subtle flicker passed over her features. Discomfort, possibly at the notion that she was complicit in these grand designs. I want what's best for my people, she said at last, quiet but firm. If that means forging alliances with you, then so be it. But I won't allow the North to be used as a pawn in your ambition. He nearly sighed, though he kept his composure. The North is no pawn, it's a partner. You hold the ancestral seat, the loyalty of proud houses, and your name evokes reverence. We shall do nothing that undermines House Stark's legitimacy. If anything, we'll bolster it across the realm, letting the other lords see that the Starks and the Vale stand for unity in a time of chaos. She rose from her bench then, smoothing the fabric of her fur-trimmed cloak. Then let us hope the chaos in the south breaks in our favor. We can discuss what to do with it when spring draws nearer and the roads open. Peter stood as well, bowing his head in acknowledgement. Spring may be far off, but the lines of conflict are already being drawn. We need only to fan them in the right direction. She turned away, her footsteps echoing faintly as she left the hall, her posture reflecting both dignity and unease. He watched her go, reminded once more of how far she had come from the naive girl who had once idolized Joffrey Baratheon as a golden prince. Now she was a leader in her own right, cautious, steeled by hardship. He wondered if that might prove problematic when the time came for him to take the final step. Silence settled around him, and after a few moments, he walked out into the main corridor. His mind drifted to the letters that had to be written, the ravens that needed sending, so many tiny threads of his larger tapestry. He would guide them all. He would ensure every rumor, every fear, every feud found the path he deemed most advantageous. And in that swirl of chaos, when the realm looked for someone to restore order, he would be there, not as the ephemeral master of coin, but as a king that no one had expected and no one quite knew how to oppose. Over the following weeks, the snows thickened. Winter's grip tightened around the north. Hunting parties returned with fewer and fewer successful kills. Still, they managed. The Vale's supply lines, which Peter had carefully arranged, brought wagons laden with grain and salted meats. Storehouses inside Winterfell and at nearby towns stood moderately stocked. The people might feel the bite of the cold, but they would not starve as they once might have. Such stability further endeared House Stark's renewed rule, and by extension, Baelish's leadership in practical matters, to the northern lords. Amid the ice and wind, Peter continued to dispatch and receive ravens. Some of the birds carried messages from the Riverlands, describing Jaime Lannister's attempts to rally. Others came from King's Landing, painting an increasingly grim portrait of Tommen's reign, overshadowed by the High Sparrow. Rumor had it that Cersei, perhaps in a final, desperate act, attempted to seize power forcibly from the Faith, but the outcome remained uncertain, lost amid contradictory accounts of street riots and palace intrigue. Meanwhile, distant murmurings from the Reach suggested that Daenerys' supporters were pushing for a grand alliance to depose the Lannisters once and for all, but the Tyrells seemed reluctant to place themselves fully at the mercy of the Dragon Queen. Even news from the Iron Islands, where Euron Greyjoy reportedly sat the Salt Throne, hinted at unrest as he eyed the Targaryen incursion warily. Each piece of news reached Peter's ears in time, and each time, he weighed the possibilities, guiding his agents to act in subtle ways. A whisper here to underscore the risk of dragons. A bribe there to sow doubt about Targaryen intentions. A secret promise of trade or marriage for those who might break from the Lannisters at just the right moment. He likened it to playing a pipe tune in a great cavern. The echoes returned from many directions, each one shaped by the stone, but together forming a chord that bent to the piper's will. Inside Winterfell, the days grew short. Candlelight became the staple for nearly every waking hour, and thick furs the constant attire. Sansa spent much of her time with Rickon, instructing him in the ways of ruling a household. She introduced him to the castle staff, made him sit at her side when hearing minor disputes from local farmers, and at night, she told him stories of their parents, hoping to keep the Stark legacy alive in his heart. Peter observed from a distance, stepping in only when local lords or knights sought advice on more delicate matters. He knew that Rickon posed an interesting question for the future. The North would see him as the rightful male heir, overshadowing Sansa's claim. Yet, from Peter's perspective, Rickon was young, pliable, and lacking the cunning or drive that might threaten him. Furthermore, the boy trusted Sansa implicitly, and Sansa relied in many ways on Peter. So long as that chain remained unbroken, Rickon was no threat. Indeed, he might one day be a figurehead for broader alliances, particularly if Peter decided that a marriage pact for Rickon could unify the North with some other region. A well-placed match could be invaluable. Beyond Winterfell's walls, the winter storms sometimes abated, leaving the world in a hush. On one such rare, clear day, Peter ventured outside with a small entourage. The sun hung low in a pale sky, its light glinting off a landscape of dazzling white. The moat around the castle had half frozen over, and the wind whipped at the bare branches of the godswood. Over the ramparts, one could see the wide plains stretching out, frosted with snow so pristine it almost hurt the eyes to look at it. As Peter stood near the main gate, one of the watchmen reported a lone rider approaching through the drifts. Soon, that rider resolved into a battered figure with the crest of House Manderley on his cloak, leaning exhausted in the saddle. He carried a message for Lady Stark, and at once, Peter had him ushered inside to thaw. The man's face was frostbitten, and he could barely speak until he had been given hot broth. Eventually, the Manderley messenger managed to deliver a sealed parchment to Peter, who opened it with a flick of a small dagger. The words were penned in a hurried but bold script, bearing Wyman Manderley's mark. He stated that White Harbor had received visitors, ships from the east that flew dragon banners. A Targaryen emissary had landed in secret, possibly scouting the northern coasts, or seeking an alliance, or merely testing the waters of negotiation. Lord Manderley wrote that he was hesitant to treat openly with the Targaryen party without first consulting Winterfell, especially since they traveled in small numbers and offered no direct threat. He requested guidance from Lady Stark and from the Vale's leadership. Peter read the letter twice, feeling the shift in the air. So, the Targaryens were inching closer, perhaps testing northern resolve or searching for weaknesses. They might even be trying to circumvent the more obvious southern routes, where they faced direct conflict. If Daenerys had learned of House Stark's resurgence, she might consider forging a northern alliance to box in the Lannisters or any other rivals from both sides of the continent. He could practically see the next moves on the board. If the Targaryens courted the north, they would promise leniency, independence, or some form of alliance to ensure they could march south uncontested. In exchange, they might demand fealty or oaths to fight the White Walkers, if rumors of the undead threat were to be believed. The notion of White Walkers still seemed fantastical, but there had been enough whispered reports of whites and strange sights beyond the wall to give even Peter a hint of caution. Real or not, such tales could unify the North behind whomever they saw as a strong protector. Peter wanted that to be him. He wasted no time summoning Sansa, who appeared in a thick cloak, accompanied by 2 Stark guards. She accepted the letter and read it, her brow knitting with concern. When she spoke, her voice carried the tension beneath her composed exterior. If Daenerys truly has envoys in White Harbor, we can't just ignore them. We should speak with them, see what they want. Peter nodded. Indeed, but we must handle it carefully. A Targaryen alliance could serve us, or it could undo everything we've built if we're not the ones directing the terms. She folded the parchment, pressing it against her chest. How do we proceed? He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. We invite them to Winterfell under safe conduct, if they are so inclined. If they refuse, Lord Manderley can negotiate on our behalf. But if they do come, we must greet them with courtesy, not subservience. Let them see a united North, ready to hold its ground unless they offer an alliance that respects Stark authority. Meanwhile, we glean what we can about Daenerys's true intentions, her resources, and what she might demand in return for peace. We can then decide if we prefer to parley or stand against her. Sansa exhaled, her breath fogging in the cold air. All right, I'll write to Lord Manderley at once. Over the next fortnight, ravens flew to and from White Harbor, relaying formal invitations and guarded replies. The Targaryen envoys, it seemed, were cautious but not unwilling to visit. They traveled by ship at first, then overland by sledge and horseback where the snow grew impassable. After many delays, a small procession arrived at Winterfell's gates in the heart of winter. Peter watched from the battlements as the visitors approached. At their head rode a woman with short-cropped silver hair, surely not Daenerys herself, but perhaps a Valyrian-blooded retainer or close advisor. She was accompanied by several men in mismatched armor, their faces set with grim purpose, and they carried a single banner depicting a three-headed dragon in black and red. Behind them trailed a wagon with locked chests, perhaps gifts or supplies. When the group dismounted in the courtyard, Sansa, Rickon, and Peter stood ready, flanked by a mix of Northern and Vale guards. The woman with silver hair bowed politely, her accent tinged with the lilts of Essos. She introduced herself as Doria Ramaz, an envoy of Daenerys Targaryen. Her words were chosen carefully, hinting that the Dragon Queen wished for good relations with all parts of the Seven Kingdoms, especially the Starks, given the rumors that they had reclaimed Winterfell. Sansa welcomed them to Winterfell, extending the courtesies that were expected of a highborn host, offering warmth and refreshment. Doria seemed grateful, remarking on the bitter cold in a tone that implied she had never experienced anything quite like a northern winter. Peter observed her carefully, noting the nerves hidden beneath her refined manners. They gathered in the great hall, where a modest fire burned. Over spiced wine and a simple meal, Doria spoke of Daenerys' intentions to break the wheel of tyrants, to end the cycle of bloody conflict that had gripped Westeros. She extolled her queen's virtues, her mercy, her commitment to justice, her liberation of slaves across the narrow sea. With a subtle shift of her tone, she also reminded them that Daenerys commanded dragons and a substantial army, including the Unsullied and Dothraki, and that she preferred peaceful integration of the North into her domain, but stood ready to enforce her claim if necessary. Sansa listened politely, occasionally trading a glance with Peter. Rickon watched from the side, his posture still uncertain in these matters of diplomacy. Peter could see the tension in the boy's jaw whenever dragons were mentioned. Most Northerners had never even seen a real dragon, but the memory of Aegon's conquest was inscribed in songs and history. It was enough to make even a child anxious. When it was Sansa's turn to speak, she thanked Doria for the courtesy and recounted the North's sufferings. The War of the Five Kings, the Bolton's treachery, the constant battle for survival in a harsh land. She made it clear that the North had repelled tyrants before and had little appetite to submit to another, no matter how well-intentioned. She offered the courtesy of continued talks, but refrained from promising fealty or an audience with Daenerys. Rickon, by Sansa's prompting, added a few words about the Stark legacy. The effect was subtle but potent, a reminder that House Stark was more than just another rebellious house. It was the North incarnate. Throughout the exchange, Peter remained quiet, chiming in only once or twice to discuss the Vale's involvement. He portrayed the Vale as a stalwart ally of House Stark, unimpressed by southern squabbles, but open to peaceful coexistence so long as Daenerys recognized northern and Vale autonomy. Doria's expression tightened slightly at the mention of autonomy, but she said nothing that implied immediate aggression. It was a dance of courtesy and hidden agendas, each side measuring the other. At the meeting's end, Doria and her retinue were shown to guest quarters. After they departed the hall, Sansa turned to Peter, her voice hushed. "They come with talk of peace and unification, but do you think they truly want that?" Peter tapped his chin thoughtfully. "Daenerys Targaryen may well believe in a kinder rule than the Lannisters, but power is rarely benevolent once threatened. If we do not bend to her demands eventually, she'll unleash her armies or her dragons, especially if she feels that subduing the North and the Vale would assure her dominion over the entire continent. She needs to look invincible to keep the other regions in line." Rickon swallowed audibly. "We can't fight dragons. Not unless the tales of the long-dead king in the North hold some secret." Even then, Peter laid a hand on Rickon's shoulder in what he meant to be a reassuring gesture. "No direct fight will be necessary if we maneuver properly. If Daenerys' hold is not as absolute as her envoys claim, and I suspect it isn't, she'll face resistance in the south. The Tyrells might still oppose her if they feel overshadowed. The Iron Islands, Dorne, the Stormlands, there are countless points of friction. We can capitalize on those divisions." Sansa's eyes narrowed. "Which means sowing more chaos, pitting them against each other." "Yes," Peter said softly. "In war, the side that stands back and lets the others tear each other apart often emerges the strongest, especially if it enters the fray only at the pivotal moment. That is how we claimed the North, is it not?" Sansa nodded reluctantly, remembering how the Vale's knights had arrived to crush the Boltons at precisely the right time. Very well, but if Daenerys demands we choose a side soon, Peter considered. We feign interest, buy time, and extract as many concessions as possible. Offer them hospitality, let them believe the North might come around. In parallel, we keep feeding divisions elsewhere. If Daenerys is busy quelling uprisings in the south, she won't have the strength to invade us immediately. And if eventually it seems she will triumph despite everything, we can negotiate from a position of strength, not abject surrender. Later that evening, as the castle beds were prepared and the Targaryen envoys settled behind thick stone walls, Peter retired to his solar with a cup of mulled wine. The aroma of cloves and cinnamon drifted around him as he stared into the dancing flames of the hearth. This meeting with Daenerys' envoys was a crucial juncture. It confirmed that the Targaryens were indeed pushing beyond the Stormlands, seeking alliances or subjugation. Peter had expected such an overture eventually, but not necessarily through White Harbor. That indicated Daenerys was probing all potential routes. Clever, he thought. She wanted to encircle her rivals, not just rush at them. Over the next few days, formal discussions continued. Doria Ramas and her companions made polite conversation at dinner, praising the stark beauty of the North while subtly reiterating how Daenerys wished to restore peace. Sansa responded in kind, carefully avoiding any direct pledge. Peter orchestrated smaller meetings in side chambers, where the envoys asked about trade possibilities, grain shipments in exchange for southern spices or gold. On the surface, these talks seemed benign, but both sides knew they were dancing around the larger question of fealty. Quietly, Peter used these sessions to glean intelligence. How many dragons did Daenerys truly have? 3, from all accounts, though one might be rumored to wander or to be more temperamental. Did she have alliances with the Dornish? Possibly, though that remained unconfirmed. The envoys claimed the Dornish had welcomed her, but Peter suspected that might be an exaggeration. And what of the Tyrells? Doria insisted the Tyrells were in negotiations with Daenerys for a more equitable alliance. But from Peter's vantage, the Tyrells could easily recoil if they believed the Targaryens intended to overshadow them. Bits and pieces of these revelations slipped out as Doria and her retinue spoke a little too freely in the presence of certain servants, who were actually Peter's spies. All the while, the cold pressed in. One morning, a fierce blizzard swept across Winterfell, piling snow in the courtyards and half-burying the outer walls. Travelers were forced to huddle for days indoors. The Targaryen envoys grumbled at the conditions, unaccustomed to such unrelenting weather. Peter used that to his advantage, ensuring the envoys felt both the sting of northern winter and the generosity of House Stark's hospitality. He provided extra furs, warm baths, hearty meals. Let them see that resisting the North in its own season would be a daunting task. Let them think that forging a polite accord was the easier path. But Peter knew a storm of a different kind brewed beyond the walls of Winterfell, one of shifting allegiances, rumors of unstoppable dragons, and the political fracturing of the southern kingdoms. He sat with Sansa at times, planning their next moves. They wrote carefully worded letters to lords in the Riverlands, to certain Vale houses, to the Manderleys, Serwyns, Glovers, and more. The gist was always the same. Daenerys Targaryen reaches out, but the North and the Vale remain steadfast in their autonomy. We stand ready to defend our land and traditions, but we will listen if she offers true mutual respect. This nuanced stance kept them from painting themselves as enemies of the new power in the south, yet it also reassured local lords that they would not kneel so readily. The day came when the storms subsided enough for the Targaryen party to consider departing. Doria made one last appeal to Sansa in the Great Hall, praising her graciousness as a hostess and urging her to consider the benefits of a united Westeros under a Targaryen banner. Sansa, with Peter standing at her shoulder, replied that House Stark always considered alliances that upheld the North's interests, and that she hoped Daenerys Targaryen's vision included genuine respect for northern sovereignty. The envoys left with a promise to deliver those sentiments to their queen. Once they were gone, and the echo of their horses' hooves faded into the swirling snow, Peter felt a subtle shift in the mood of Winterfell. The meeting had been civil, but the sense of tension remained. like a slack bowstring that could be drawn taut at any moment. Sansa convened her northern lords, discussing the developments. Most expressed concern that Daenerys's overtures were a ploy to secure the north without a fight, only for her to conquer them later. A few believed forging an immediate pact would spare them a dragon's wrath. In the end, no consensus was reached, save to remain cautious. Peter assured them that, for now, the Targaryens seemed occupied elsewhere and would not march north in the depths of winter. Rickon, for his part, withdrew after the council, unsettled by talk of dragons. It was still difficult for him to imagine another war so soon after his captivity. Sansa tried to reassure him, but his eyes betrayed an unease that Peter understood all too well. The boy was frightened by the scale of looming conflicts. Rightly so, Peter thought. War was an ugly business. Winter ground on. Weeks turned into months, and the roads remained largely impassable. Reports from the south arrived sporadically, sometimes several at once after a delay. They painted a picture of King's Landing locked in a power struggle between the diminishing Lannister influence, the Faith militants' overreach, and the Tyrells' half-hearted attempts to maintain royal ties. Word came of uprisings in the Stormlands, where local lords resented the Targaryens' presence. Braavos, it was said, had reopened negotiations with certain lords, perhaps seeking to recover outstanding debts. Little by little, the cracks widened in every corner of the realm. Peter thrived on those cracks. Like a spider at the center of a web, he tugged gently, encouraging each faction to work at cross purposes, ensuring that no single force grew too dominant too quickly. It was crucial that the Targaryens face enough southern resistance to keep them from focusing on the north. Yet, at the same time, he did not want them to be so battered that they collapsed entirely before he was ready to make his move. If Daenerys were toppled prematurely, another pretender might rise, or the Lannisters might regain ground, unraveling his plans. The realm needed to be locked in just enough conflict that Peter could position himself as the ultimate mediator or conqueror, once the snows melted and armies could march. One dark winter evening, as Peter walked the corridors alone, he heard the shuffle of small feet behind him. He paused and turned, half expecting a servant, but found Rickon Stark standing there, arms crossed over a thick wool tunic. The boy's hair was shaggy, his cheeks pink from cold. He regarded Peter with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Lord Baelish," Rickon said, his voice still carrying a youthful timbre. "May I speak with you?" Peter inclined his head. "Of course, my lord. What troubles you?" Rickon advanced until he was only a few steps away, glancing around to see if anyone else was near. Satisfied they were alone, he looked up at Peter. "You helped save me from the Boltons. You brought Sansa back to Winterfell. You say you want to help us. But sometimes, I wonder why. The men in the yard say a lot of different things. They call you cunning. They say you play games with everyone." Peter studied the boy's earnest gaze. He realized that if Rickon was questioning him this directly, it meant the child's apprehensions had grown. Perhaps he had overheard lords whispering that Peter Baelish had bigger ambitions, or had gleaned it from Sansa's guarded looks. Peter lowered himself to one knee, so he was closer to Rickon's eye level, a subtle gesture intended to disarm and reassure. "Rickon," he began gently, "when I was your age, I had few prospects. I grew up in the Fingers, barren, rocky strips of land that yield little. I was always called Littlefinger because of it. I learned that if you want to rise in this world, you cannot rely on birthright alone. I had to be clever, to make alliances, to see opportunities where others did not. But that doesn't mean I don't care about the well-being of those I've helped. If I simply wanted power for power's sake, I could have let the Boltons keep you prisoner and tried to ally with them. Instead, I brought the Knights of the Vale to free Winterfell." Rickon's brow furrowed. "So you do it because you're a friend to House Stark? Or because you see something else in it?" Peter chose his words carefully. "Both, in truth. I admired your father, Ned Stark, for his honor, though I did not share all his views. I loved your mother in my own way when we were both very young. Helping you and Sansa is something that feels right to me, something that corrects old wrongs. But yes, I also have ambition. and the best way for me to protect you is if I have enough power to keep any enemies from daring to challenge our alliance. That might mean forging new pacts, maybe even wearing a crown if the realm collapses further. Would you rather see someone else? Someone cruel? Seize power? Or see me and your sister work together to keep the North safe? Rickon lowered his gaze, thinking it over. We Starks usually do things differently than cunning, but these are different times. Sansa says so. Peter nodded, softening his voice. They are different times indeed, and sometimes cunning is the only way to preserve what matters. I promise you, Rickon, I'll do everything I can to ensure the North remains strong and House Stark stands. Do I have your trust? Rickon hesitated, then gave a small nod. Sansa says I should trust you. She says you're the reason we have Winterfell back at all. But if you ever hurt her or betray the North— The boy's voice trembled, trying to sound brave. I'll never forgive you. Peter gently placed a hand on Rickon's shoulder. Fair enough, my lord. I'll remember that. With that, Rickon turned and padded away, leaving Peter alone once more in the corridor. He rose to his feet, adjusting the folds of his cloak. A flicker of something passed through his chest. Not quite guilt, but an awareness that Rickon's trust was fragile, and that someday he might have to act in ways that even Sansa wouldn't condone. But for now, the boy's words only served as a reminder that House Stark was the key to everything. Keeping their loyalty was essential. Time in winter seemed interminable, but eventually word came that the snows were lessening in the south, that rivers were thawing. The first hints of an early spring in certain regions reached the north. Ravaged though the realm was, armies would soon be able to move again. That prospect both stirred and worried many in Winterfell. If the Targaryens consolidated, they might march north to compel submission. If the Lannisters clung to power somehow, a battered but dangerous force might also try to reassert itself over rebellious lands. The question hung over every council meeting. What would the North and the Vale do when the roads opened? Peter had an answer, though he played his hand close. He wanted to see how the final lines of conflict would shape up in the southern kingdoms. Would the Tyrells remain half-allied with the Targaryens or break away entirely? Would the Martells intervene? Would the Iron Islands remain neutral or launch raids? Each factor would dictate where and how Peter would inject the might of the North and the Vale. He had orchestrated much of this complexity, but the realm was too vast for him to control every variable. He had to remain adaptive. One morning, as the mildest sunshine in months lit up Winterfell's courtyard, a raven arrived from the Riverlands bearing news that changed the calculus. Jaime Lannister had been ambushed by remnants of the Brotherhood without banners near the ruins of an old sept, and though he escaped, his forces were scattered, forcing him to take refuge in Harrenhal. Rumor suggested that Cersei was no longer in control of King's Landing, having been ousted or arrested by the Faith Militant after some violent altercation. Margaery Tyrell and her grandmother, the formidable Lady Olenna, had brokered a deal that placed Margaery in a position of influence alongside the Faith, leaving Tommen effectively a puppet. The Lannisters, it seemed, were truly on the brink of collapse. Some said Kevan Lannister or other lesser members tried to salvage alliances, but with little success. This was the moment Peter had been waiting for, the near-total fragmentation of the Lannister hold, which had once been the greatest threat to his ambitions. Now, if the Targaryens advanced on King's Landing, the city would likely fall without a cohesive Lannister defense. If the Tyrells or the Faith Militant intervened, it might become a three-way clash. Peter's eyes practically gleamed at the possibilities. He called Sansa and the leading northern lords to a council in Winterfell's Great Hall. The fire crackled high, casting warmth over a gathering of fur-wrapped figures. Lords Manderly, Glover, Serwyn, and Royce from the Vale all took seats around a long table, while Sansa presided at the head, Rickon to her right. Peter stood to her left, playing the role of trusted advisor. "We have fresh intelligence on the state of the South," Peter began after the customary greetings. "The Lannisters are in disarray. Jaime Lannister is holed up in Harrenhal, presumably with a fraction of his forces. King's Landing is effectively under the Faith Militant's sway, with the Tyrells maneuvering to maintain influence. Meanwhile, Daenerys Targaryen has made gains in the Stormlands and threatens to push toward the capital. Lord Glover, a heavy-set man with graying hair, drummed his fingers on the table. Are you suggesting we march south? Our men are weary, and we've only just secured the north after the Bolton horrors. Peter dipped his head, acknowledging the point. I understand the reluctance, but consider, if Daenerys takes King's Landing unopposed, she will stand as the uncontested ruler of the South. Her dragons alone would deter many. Should that happen, she could then turn her full attention northward, demanding our submission. We would face her alone, or with minimal allies. Lord Manderley frowned. But if we march south, we risk our men's lives, and for what? To save the Lannisters? The Tyrells? They never cared for the North. We've always been ignored or exploited by Southern kings. Peter let a moment of silence stretch, letting the tension mount. I'm not suggesting we save the Lannisters. I'm suggesting we let the Southern powers weaken each other further, then position ourselves as a deciding factor on our terms. We might negotiate with the Tyrells or the Faith from a place of strength, or even with certain Targaryen factions who fear they cannot hold everything. The point is that we choose the winning side at the opportune time, ensuring we are rewarded with recognition, resources, perhaps even the monarchy itself if matters align that way. The lords murmured among themselves. One or two cast glances at Sansa, uncertain. Sansa's face remained composed, though tension pinched the corners of her mouth. What exactly does the North gain from taking on that risk? Asked Lady Serwyn, who had been present during the retaking of Winterfell. We're free. We've endured so much. Could we not remain neutral behind our walls, letting the South burn itself out? Peter turned to her, schooling his expression carefully. That is a tempting thought, my lady. However, neutrality won't protect us forever if a power like Daenerys eventually seeks to unify all 7 kingdoms under her banner. She may offer us a measure of autonomy now, but if she grows unchallenged, she'll impose her will sooner or later. And if the rumors of White Walkers hold any truth, we might need Southern cooperation or Southern resources to face that threat. Being cut off from the rest of the realm could doom us if the worst nightmares beyond the wall are real. At the mention of White Walkers, some of the lords shifted uncomfortably. The rumor of undead in the far north was still met with skepticism by many, but enough uncertain tales filtered down from the wall to make them uneasy. Lord Royce of the Vale cleared his throat. You think the Targaryens would come to our aid against such a threat if they're fixated on conquest? Peter shrugged. Perhaps, but only on their terms. My lords, I propose a strategy of selective intervention. We dispatch envoys, indeed we could dispatch an armed contingent, to the Riverlands, forging alliances or deals with those who would oppose the Lannisters or the Targaryens on unfavorable terms. We ensure that no single faction gains too much ground, all while we build up our own strength. Then, when the time is right, the North and the Vale march together to tip the balance and determine the realm's new order. The gathered lords exchanged glances, measuring the risk. The North was tired of war, but war seemed inevitable, given the unstoppable tides to the south. Finally, Sansa's voice broke the silence. You know the consequences if we fail, Lord Baelish. The men here have lost loved ones in the previous wars. Another war could bleed us dry. Peter bowed his head to her. I won't pretend there is no danger, but doing nothing also carries grave risk. One final campaign with careful planning might secure peace for a generation. If the North holds back completely and the Targaryens assume the throne unopposed, we'll have no bargaining power, no recognition of our sovereignty. We could end up bending the knee all over again, or worse. That's the last thing Eddard Stark's children would want, is it not? Sansa's jaw tightened. She scanned the faces of the lords and ladies present, clearly torn. At length, she turned back to Peter. What do you recommend as our immediate step? Peter paused, as if weighing his words carefully, though he had planned this answer for months. We send a significant yet not overwhelmingly large force to the Riverlands. Enough knights to show we are serious, but not so many that we leave ourselves vulnerable here. We assist in restoring order, offering to aid those houses that resent the Lannisters or the Targaryens. We become the mediators, the protectors, taking over holdfasts that have been abandoned or lie in disrepair. We build alliances with the local lords, reminding them of your Tully blood, Lady Stark. During this time, we watch carefully for the Targaryen movements. If Daenerys attempts to seize King's Landing, we decide whether to intervene to prevent a rout or whether to let her clash with the Faith and the Tyrells. We keep the Vale's main strength here, under your command, ready to march if the moment arises. Essentially, we expand our influence step by step, so that by the time Daenerys or anyone else tries to claim absolute rule, they find half the realm already leans on us for stability. A hush followed. Lord Glover picked at his glove. Lady Serwyn exchanged a murmured comment with one of her bannermen. Lord Royce nodded slowly, clearly seeing the advantage for the Vale to extend its presence into the Riverlands. Sansa let out a slow breath. We cannot let the men starve or freeze while we do this. We must ensure supply lines. Peter nodded. I have that arranged. The Vale has reserves, and certain Riverland towns have begun to recover harvests. By the time we move, spring will be closer down there. We can manage it. Silence again. Then, in a voice both weary and resolute, Sansa said, It seems we have little choice. If we remain idle, we risk subjugation later. If we march recklessly, we risk destruction. A measured approach in the Riverlands might preserve our freedom. Very well, Lord Baelish. You'll lead a host to secure key positions, but do not overextend. The North will provide some men, but we must keep a strong force here in case of a direct threat. Peter bowed respectfully, hiding the surge of satisfaction in his chest. I shall do as you command, my lady. And so the council agreed. Word spread through Winterfell and beyond that Lord Peter Baelish was assembling a contingent to travel south as winter's grip loosened. The Knights of the Vale, who owed him loyalty as their Lord Protector, formed the backbone of this expedition. A smaller cadre of northern soldiers joined them as well, men who had proven themselves loyal to Sansa and her vision of a secured realm. Supplies were readied, wagons inspected, horses shod. Peter oversaw every detail, ensuring that coin flowed where it was needed, forging new deals with local suppliers so that no one would lack for bread or furs once they crossed into the Riverlands. Before the host departed, Peter had a final meeting with Sansa in her solar. She stood by a narrow window, overlooking the courtyard below, where knights drilled in the snow. Her cloak was trimmed with white fur, and her breath fogged the glass as she spoke. Promise me you'll remember who you represent, Peter. The North has been betrayed too many times. I won't allow you to make deals that jeopardize our people. He stepped closer, his voice low. I represent House Stark, the Vale, and our combined interests. Remember, if I fail, we all suffer. I won't betray you, Sansa. You have my word. She turned, her blue eyes piercing. Words are wind, but I must trust you, mustn't I? He reached out, gently clasping one of her hands. Trust in what we've built here. Winterfell stands because we made it stand. The Vale stands with us because we gave them a cause worth rallying to. That won't change. Not if we keep moving forward. She let her hand linger in his for a moment, then pulled away. Go then, and good fortune. I'll hold the North while you secure our influence. If you need reinforcements, send word. But I won't let the castle go undefended. He inclined his head. Wise. The Targaryens might send another envoy, or worse, a winged beast overhead. It's best you be prepared. She offered a faint smile, though it was laced with worry. I will be. Soon after, Peter descended to the courtyard. The knights had gathered, resplendent in their armor, the crests of the Vale shining amid the furs they wore against the cold. A smaller number of northern soldiers stood interspersed, carrying the direwolf sigil on their banners. Horses stamped and snorted, their breath steaming. Peter mounted a sleek chestnut courser, adjusting his reins. The day was overcast, but not bitterly cold. One of those transitional days hinting that spring might eventually come. Before him stretched the open gates of Winterfell, leading to a road partially cleared by laborers. This route would take them south, past Moat Cailin, and into the Riverlands, where scattered rumors of brigands and broken men still abounded. Peter gazed up at the battlements. He caught a glimpse of Sansa and Rickon standing above, watching. He raised a gloved hand in salute, and Sansa gave a small nod in return. The column set out, hooves crunching in the snow. Peter rode at the head, cloaked in fine black wool, wearing his mockingbird pin, a subtle but unwavering statement of his personal identity within these grand alliances. Behind him, the Vale Knight's steel glimmered, and the northern men carried themselves with a fierce pride. Their mission, to spread House Stark's authority and the Vale's influence into the Riverlands under Peter Baelish's guiding hand. In his mind, Peter mapped out the next steps. First, secure Harrenhal, or rather, coerce it to yield. If Jaime Lannister still lurked within those melted towers, this might be an opportunity to capture or dispatch him. Then, gather the smaller houses of the Trident, reasserting control with the Tully name. Possibly install a caretaker who would answer to Peter. The seeds of new alliances would be planted there, and by the time the Targaryens or the Tyrells realized what was happening, he would have a foothold extending half the length of Westeros. A quiet excitement thrummed in him. Every step brought him closer to the final ambition he had nurtured all his life. He had once told Sansa of his dream, to sit upon the Iron Throne, to rule all the Seven Kingdoms as the undisputed power. That dream no longer felt like mere fancy. Bit by bit, region by region, he was gathering the pieces needed to make it real. The road south was long and at times perilous. Late winter storms occasionally swept down, forcing the column to set camp early or find shelter in half-ruined keeps. The men grumbled at the cold, but Peter had arranged ample provisions, so morale stayed reasonably high. Whenever they stopped near a settlement, Peter or one of his lieutenants would speak with the local folk, offering coin in exchange for information, forging small connections. News traveled in both directions. The Targaryen presence in the Stormlands had grown, though the assault on King's Landing was not yet confirmed. The Faith militants' grip on the capital tightened. Jaime Lannister was indeed near Harrenhal, rumored to be rallying men from scattered Lannister loyalists. Peter filed each fact away. Eventually, the great fortress of Moat Cailin came into view, a brooding structure of ancient towers, half sunken into the swampy landscape. It guarded the neck, that narrow land bridge between the north and the rest of Westeros. Peter and his knights passed unchallenged, for the forces stationed there recognized the banner of the Vale and the authority of Lady Stark. Then they continued south, leaving behind the last real barrier that protected the north. It was a strangely momentous feeling for Peter, this crossing, like stepping into another world. The Riverlands sprawled ahead, battered by war and neglect, but still holding a resource-rich territory that could fuel his plans. Days turned into weeks, and the weather eased bit by bit. The men shed their thickest layers, though the nights remained chilly. They saw more travelers on the roads, from merchants hoping to resume trade to ragged peasants searching for a home after years of devastation. Occasionally, they encountered pockets of brigands or sellswords turned bandits. Peter gave orders to scatter them decisively, but not cruelly, ensuring that any survivors spread word of a disciplined force from the north and the Vale, claiming the land under House Stark's banner. Their reputation as a stabilizing power would grow. When at last the broken towers of Harrenhal loomed on the horizon, tinted by the wan sunlight in a hazy gray, Peter drew rein and studied them. The fortress was massive, still the largest castle in the Seven Kingdoms, though it had been cursed with misfortune since the days of Aegon's conquest. Its melted walls and gargantuan spires bore testament to dragon fire long ago. Now, the place felt haunted, looming over the surrounding waters like a morbid sentinel. Scouts returned with reports that Jaime Lannister and a band of several hundred men held the fortress. Rumor suggested that Jaime was ill or wounded from the ambush, though details were sparse. The Lannisters had tried to gather local levies, but with the main Lannister power in disarray, few answered their call. It was an opportunity Peter could not ignore. He called a halt, setting up camp within sight of Harrenhal's walls. The men erected tents and fortified their perimeter with sharpened stakes and ditches, necessary precautions in a land rife with treachery. From his command tent, Peter dispatched a messenger under a flag of truce to demand an audience with whoever spoke for Jaime Lannister. He styled himself as an envoy of House Stark and the Vale, here to restore order and negotiate terms that might spare further bloodshed. The next morning, the messenger returned with an odd look. Jaime Lannister, it seemed, had agreed to a meeting. He invited Peter Baelish and a small party inside Harrenhal, guaranteeing safe conduct. "He says he knows you, my lord," the messenger reported. He said, "Tell Lord Baelish I have no illusions left about this war, but let us speak plainly." Peter's mouth curved in a slight smile. Jaime was shrewder than most gave him credit for. He would understand that his position was precarious. "We'll accept his invitation," he said. "He won't risk harming us if he wants to negotiate, and if he does, we'll respond in kind." That afternoon, under a bright if chilly sky, Peter rode toward Harrenhal's mighty gates with a small retinue of knights. The drawbridge lowered with a heavy groan, and he passed over the dark waters of the moat, entering the shadow of the melted towers. Inside the courtyard, the place was a testament to neglect and war. Shattered stones, half-collapsed corridors, an aura of decay. A group of Lannister men awaited, garbed in dirty red and gold cloaks, their faces grim. And there, at the forefront, perched on a black warhorse, was Jaime Lannister. He had lost his famed golden hand. No, that was still there, Peter realized, though it looked tarnished and ill-maintained. Jaime himself appeared thinner, with streaks of gray in his hair, his face lined by exhaustion. He dismounted carefully, favoring his left leg, which seemed to pain him. A faint ghost of his old arrogance lingered in his stance, but mostly Peter saw resignation. "Lord Baelish," Jaime greeted, voice echoing in the courtyard. "You've come a long way from King's Landing and the Master of Coin's office." Peter slipped from his saddle, handing the reins to a knight. He approached Jaime with measured steps, a faint smile curving his lips. "And you a long way from the days when you were the realm's greatest swordsman and Cersei Lannister's champion. Times change, Ser Jaime. Or do you still go by Lord Commander of the Kingsguard?" Jaime gave a bitter laugh. "I don't think there's much left of the Kingsguard or the kingship to guard. Tommen is not in my hands. The Faith and the Tyrells have him, or what's left of him. Cersei is gone. Fled. Dead. Arrested? I hardly know. So, no, I suppose I'm just Jaime Lannister these days." Peter nodded, sympathetic in a predatory way. "You could cling to a lost cause, or you could acknowledge that House Lannister's sun is setting. I suspect you want a way out." Jaime's green eyes flickered with a trace of anger, then dulled. "What do you propose? Surrender Harrenhal to you so you can crow about your victory? Are you claiming it in the name of House Stark?" "Harrenhal belongs to the realm," Peter said softly, "and the realm is in disarray. I intend to bring order starting here. Your men are outnumbered. Even if you barricade yourself within these walls, you can't hold out indefinitely. You'll starve or we'll find a way in. But I'm not here to see you die pointlessly. I have a proposal." Jaime regarded him warily. "Speak, then." Peter gestured for Jaime to walk with him, and they moved a short distance, away from the prying ears of both retinues. In low voices, Peter explained that if Jaime relinquished Harrenhal peacefully, Peter would allow him and his men safe passage. In exchange, Jaime would provide a formal letter renouncing any Lannister claim to the Riverlands, acknowledging that House Stark, in conjunction with the Vale, was stepping in to restore stability. Jaime's men could either join Peter's ranks, if they so desired, or depart unmolested to wherever they wished. Peter would even supply them with enough provisions to make the journey. Jaime eyed him as though trying to find the catch. "You'd really spare me, after all the bad blood between the Starks and the Lannisters? You know I was the one who shoved Bran Stark from the tower, if you believe certain accusations." Peter's face betrayed no reaction, though inwardly he recalled the rumors. "Whatever your past sins, I'm more interested in the future. House Lannister is no threat to me if I can remove you from Harrenhal without a protracted siege. We can always renegotiate your status later, if you wish to remain in the realm, or you can find a quiet corner of the world to lick your wounds. I don't care, as long as you don't interfere. Jaime grimaced. And if I refuse? If I think I can hold this place a while longer? Peter spread his hands, as if offering an olive branch. You'll die in a ruin, your men starve, and I'll eventually claim Harrenhal anyway. Choose wisely, Jaime. Silence stretched, broken only by the wind whistling through cracks in the scorched walls. Jaime turned his gaze to the ancient towers, the molten stone sagging like wax. A place haunted by curses and ghosts. Indeed. Finally, he sighed. Fine, he said, voice laden with defeat. I've no will left to fight. I'll surrender Harrenhal, provided your terms guarantee safe passage for my men. But I can't speak for them all. Some might defect to your cause. Others might try brigandry. I can't stop them. Peter nodded. Fair enough. We'll sort out the details. You'll put your seal on a statement that House Lannister yields claim to Harrenhal. We'll supply your men with rations for the road. I assume you'll want to head west, perhaps to Casterly Rock, if the old seat of your house still stands. Jaime almost laughed. That rock is all that's left of our legacy, I suppose. Perhaps I'll find no welcome there. Or maybe I'll vanish on the roads. It hardly matters now. They shook hands, Jaime's flesh hand to Peter's gloved one, striking a bargain that underscored the collapse of the once mighty Lannisters. By nightfall, the gates of Harrenhal swung wide, and Peter's knights rode in to secure the fortress. There was no bloodshed beyond a few minor scuffles with stubborn men who believed they had nothing left to lose. Jaime, for his part, kept his word. He had a chest containing the official Lannister seals, and he used them to formalize the surrender. Peter ensured those documents went straight to his scribes, who would circulate copies through the Riverlands and beyond, underscoring that the Lannisters had relinquished any claim here. In the subsequent days, Peter took stock of Harrenhal's meager supplies and dreadful condition. Still, the fortress's strategic value remained high. It lay near the center of the Riverlands, commanding multiple river routes. Peter dispatched riders to surrounding villages, proclaiming that House Stark and the Vale now offered protection. Some of the small folk, desperate for stability, came forth to pledge labor if they received assurances of fair treatment. Peter, in a show of magnanimity, provided small gifts of grain and promised a new era of order in the Riverlands. Jaime and most of his loyalists departed within a week. Peter allowed them to keep their arms, though their morale was so low that few seemed eager to challenge him. A handful joined Peter's cause, seeing no future with a doomed Lannister banner. Peter welcomed them cautiously, ensuring each was vetted. Then Jaime himself rode off one morning with a small retinue, heading west into the cold dawn. Peter watched from the battlements, a silent figure in black, as the last lion of Lannister parted ways with what remained of his own pride. Now Harrenhal was Peter's to administer. He set about establishing a command structure. His lieutenants patrolled the nearby roads, chasing off brigands and forming alliances with local petty lords who had languished under Lannister or Frey extortion. Word quickly spread. If you wanted trade to flow again, if you wanted your lands protected from outlaws, you recognized the authority of House Stark, administered by the cunning Peter Baelish. It was exactly the scenario Peter had envisioned, a slow but steady expansion of influence. In time, the snows continued to recede in the Riverlands, and the spring sun shone across fields that had lain fallow too long. Farmers began planting early crops. With Peter's encouragement and coin, some of these villages around Harrenhal returned to a semblance of life. Commerce stirred faintly. Mercenaries who once roamed aimlessly now considered taking up service under Peter's banner, for he paid in reliable silver, on the condition they upheld his laws. More threads in his ever-growing web. Within Harrenhal's great hall, no less grand for its blackened walls, Peter sat at a high seat each day, hearing petitions. He wore the mockingbird pin, but the standard behind him displayed the dire wolf of Stark and the crescent and falcon of the Vale. He was, in effect, a steward of these combined powers, but everyone recognized that he was the real authority. Scribes took down records of judgments he passed, boundary disputes, grain taxes, the punishment of criminals. Bit by bit, he enforced order, building a base from which he could exert wider control. He wrote frequently to Sansa, updating her on progress. He was careful to phrase his letters in a respectful tone, always acknowledging that Harrenhal was held in the name of House Stark. He never once used the phrase "my castle," though in practice it functioned as such. Sansa replied with polite encouragement and occasional concern about the cost in coin and manpower. Peter assured her that the Riverlands would soon pay for itself through renewed trade and taxes. He also sent letters to various riverlords, subtly reminding them of Sansa's Tully blood, which gave her a claim to represent them. Some responded favorably, especially those who despised the phrase. Others remained hesitant, waiting to see if Peter's might was truly enough to protect them from Targaryen or other threats. Spring advanced across the land, turning muddy roads into passable routes. Merchant caravans began to trickle in from the west, bringing rumor that the Lannisters had all but lost control of Casterly Rock to some uprising or mutiny. In the south, the Targaryen army was on the march toward King's Landing, where the Tyrells, the Faith Militant, and remnants of the city guard were preparing a desperate defense or possibly a negotiated surrender. The realm held its breath. If Daenerys took the capital, she might claim herself queen in name as well as in fact. Then the question would be how she dealt with the North, the Vale, and the newly stabilized Riverlands under Peter's aegis. Peter felt no rush to intervene in King's Landing. Let the Targaryens and the Faith bleed each other, he reasoned. Let the Tyrells catch the brunt of the fight. When they were sufficiently weakened or locked in negotiation, he would reveal his next move. Yet he needed to be sure the Targaryens recognized the extent of his power and hesitation. A direct confrontation with dragons, for now, was still a perilous gamble. One morning, as Peter reviewed ledgers in the Harrenhal Solar, one of his agents burst in, an older man with quick eyes, breathing heavily. "My lord, a rider from King's Landing came. They say the city has fallen." Daenerys Targaryen entered it with little resistance. The Faith Militant tried to rally, but the small folk opened the gates in hopes of mercy. It said that the High Sparrow was executed, and King Tommen, dead, thrown from a window or possibly jumped. The details are unclear. Peter's heart quickened. So the Targaryens had finally taken the capital. That meant Daenerys was now queen in more than just principle, unless some dire betrayal awaited her. He laid his quill aside. "Any word on the Tyrells or the state of the city?" The agent shook his head. "Some say the Tyrell forces withdrew at the last moment, uncertain or perhaps bribed to stand down. Others claim Lady Olenna is negotiating from a distance. But the city is apparently under Daenerys's banner. Dragons perched on the Red Keep, or so the rumors say." Peter rose from his seat, crossing to a window that overlooked the courtyard. He gazed out at the distant horizon, though King's Landing lay many leagues beyond. So the Dragon Queen sat the Iron Throne. That changed the stage drastically. The question now was how soon she would look to the rest of Westeros. If Daenerys was eager to consolidate, she might demand that all remaining lords swear fealty swiftly. Peter needed to prepare for that moment. He turned back to the agent. "Send riders at once to our contacts in the Crownlands. We need clarity on how Daenerys intends to rule. Is she planning to march outward, or is she content to secure the capital and let the realm come to her? Also, reach out to the Tyrells. Invite them to consider an alliance with the North and the Vale. Mention that if Daenerys becomes overbearing, we might collectively form a check on her power." The agent bowed and scurried out. Peter folded his hands behind his back, pacing the Solar. Daenerys had taken the throne with minimal bloodshed in the final moment, which likely boosted her popularity. The small folk, tired of Lannister misrule, might even welcome her. That was no small advantage. She had dragons, a loyal army, and now the seat of power in King's Landing. If she swiftly consolidated the Crownlands, Stormlands, and possibly the Reach, she could command a formidable portion of Westeros. Against that, the North, Vale, and Riverlands alliance still might not suffice in open battle. Yet battles were not always won by open conflict. Peter's greatest weapon was subterfuge. He could sow discord among Daenerys' followers, highlight old grudges, sabotage her supply lines, or cast doubt on her ability to manage an entire continent. If there were still ambitious lords left in the Reach, the Westerlands or Dorne who felt slighted, he could harness their dissatisfaction. If the Iron Islands hovered on the brink of rebellion, he could encourage it. The realm might resent a foreign-born queen, no matter her dragons. All these threads lay within his reach. Soon after, word arrived from the Crownlands that Daenerys Targaryen had declared her intention to unify the Seven Kingdoms peacefully if possible, offering a general pardon to those who had supported the Lannisters under duress. She extended an invitation to the great lords to visit King's Landing and bend the knee, promising that those who refused would face the full might of her armies and dragons. Peter, reading this letter, found it both shrewd and naive. Offering clemency under threat of annihilation was a standard tactic, but maintaining that stance across a fractured realm was another matter. He wasted no time calling a small council of his most trusted lieutenants at Harrenhal. They debated whether to accept Daenerys' invitation or feign compliance while secretly undermining her. Some argued that openly challenging dragons was madness, while others insisted that the North and the Vale could never accept subjugation again. Peter listened to all points before concluding that they must appear open to negotiation, but remain non-committal. He penned a letter to Daenerys Targaryen, addressing her as Your Grace, acknowledging her ascension and explaining that he stood as steward of the Riverlands under the auspices of House Stark, which had reclaimed its ancestral seat in the north. He wrote that Lady Sansa Stark's priorities lay in rebuilding a land ravaged by war, and that she and her loyal allies would be willing to discuss terms of coexistence once matters in the north were fully stabilized. It was a polite stalling tactic, one that might buy them time to see how Daenerys handled the rest of the kingdom. Days passed. Peter's confidence grew that Daenerys would face hurdles, forging alliances with the Tyrells, deciding what to do about the Westerlands, the Iron Islands, and Dorne. If any of those regions chafed under her rule, Peter could fan the flames. Meanwhile, House Stark's new territory expanded, as more Riverland houses recognized Peter's authority. Even some from the Westerlands began sending envoys, seeking refuge from the chaos after the Lannisters' downfall. Peter received them with measured courtesy, offering settlement rights in certain Riverland lands if they pledged loyalty. If enough of these smaller houses and knights flocked to his banner, he could raise a formidable host without directly confronting Daenerys yet. One evening, as spring rains pattered on Harrenhal's scorched roofs, Peter stood on a balcony high in one of the fortress's less collapsed towers. He gazed down at the shimmering puddles in the courtyard, where guards paced in the torchlight. The black walls seemed to absorb the flickering glow, giving the castle a haunted cast. He allowed himself a moment's reflection. This cursed castle, so often a grave for ambition, was now his seat of power, and from here he was orchestrating a realm-wide puzzle. He pictured, as he often did, the Iron Throne. Daenerys might have it physically for now, but if he convinced enough of the realm that she was a foreign tyrant, if he entangled her in rebellions and forced her to rely on questionable allies, she could slip. Her dragons were fearsome, yes, but they could not be everywhere at once, and they required absolute loyalty from her troops to be used effectively. The moment cracks appeared in her coalition or in her supply lines, the advantage would shift. Peter intended to be ready to EXP.